Yeah, good morning. We're starting just on time, so welcome. Bonjour à tout le monde. Je suis heureux et content d'être invité de modérer cette session aujourd'hui, mais c'est tout que je vais faire en français, le reste je vais faire en anglais. Good morning, my name is André Marcoux. I'm the Executive Director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. I want to welcome everybody here today at the session entitled Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism for Climate. The session will start now as soon as the minister comes in. There will be two keynote speeches, one from Minister Marc Ferracci, the Minister for Industry, Energy and Finance of France. And the second keynote speaker will be Mr. Gerasimos Thomas, the Director General of the Directorate General for Taxation and Customs Union of the European Commission. After that, we will have three sessions, three different panels that I will moderate, and that each panel will be followed by a short Q&A. And at the end of the session, I think there's a networking event that will take place downstairs. So if you'll allow me now to wait for the minister, I think that this is kind of very, very well attended session. There's, I understand, over 1,000 people online, so it is a well attended. There's a lot of interest for the session. It is a very timely session, considering the fact that the CBAM will enter into permanent final phase at the beginning of next year. You know very well that there's a lot of discussion in Brussels around simplification, and it's only simplification for CSRD and CS3D, but there's also simplification of CBAM, and there have been discussions around that. We're all waiting anxiously February 26th to see what would be in the simplification package. But needless to say, I also want to emphasize the importance that this is being given around the world to this directive and the impact that this directive is having around the world. So it is a moment that for all of us, for industry, it's important. It's a moment whereby the CBAM, which is not a minor part of the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55, is quite central to that part. It is very central to European competitiveness, is something that we all want to succeed. We have learned a lot of things for the last few years as being operational. We'll see some of it in the review at mid-year. There's going to be increasing discussions as we move on and as the simplification package makes its way through, as the review would make its way through. There is unfinished business. As you well know, there's unfinished business with circumvention, there's business with export, and so on. But I am speaking because I'm trying to burn time and wait for the minister to come, as you probably have figured out by now. I can speak for about CBAM because we've been working about CBAM for 6 years, so I can't speak about CBAM for a lot longer, but I'm looking at my French host here, and I think it's, do I keep going or he's coming? Okay. So it is my pleasure and my honor to invite Mr. Marc Ferracci, who's the Minister for Industry and Energy of France, to give the first keynote speech. Mr. Minister?
Your Excellency, dear speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you today here in Bercy and online for this high-level conference on the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. CBAM is a new policy, and the question now is how to make sure it works. CBAM was a long-standing priority for France, and we worked hard to design it and get it passed into law under the French presidency of the Council of the European Union in 2022. It was here, in this very room, that a very important meeting on CBAM was held in March 2021. The participants included many experts and political decision makers from all over the world. That meeting, which was in many ways similar to today's conference, paved the way for this new political mechanism. 4 years later, this new meeting is the first high-level conference about CBAM, and we must be proud of it. We are here today to discuss about its implementation with all the stakeholders. That is why this event promises to be a landmark conference. You will find in this room many representatives of the EU members and the European Commission also, but also other stakeholders and partners from abroad, from the World Trade Organization, the OECD, and the like. And of course, many participants from industry, academia, and civil society. I would also like to extend my warmest thanks to our high-level speakers who come from a wide range of backgrounds. I have no doubt that your contributions will make this event very insightful. Now, let's turn to CBAM. CBAM is a key element of the Green Deal, and the Green Deal is nothing but the most ambitious decarbonization strategy on the planet. As you know, the EU has set itself the goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 and has committed to reducing its net emissions by at least 55% in 2030 compared to 1990. So the Green Deal changes the whole game. Now, the green transition is at the heart of the EU's economic strategy. Why? Because we believe that it is possible to reconcile ecological ambition and competitiveness. This was confirmed by Mario Draghi's reports. Decarbonizing the economy is essential not only for the climate, but also for the future of European competitiveness. This vision, I share it. This vision has far-reaching consequences. We have no choice but to rethink the economy and international trade in the light of decarbonization. And we have a particular responsibility in this respect, because the European Union is a global leader in international trade. The EU is the second largest exporter after China, and the second largest importer after the United States. So Europe is the hub of international trade. In other words, we can and we must act. That's where CBAM comes in. CBAM was designed to ensure that Europeans' decarbonization efforts are not hindered by carbon leakage. Because, after all, you can massively reduce your carbon emissions at home, but your carbon footprint won't improve if you import even more high-emission products from abroad. That's why the stakes are both ecological and industrial, because we want to avoid relocations. Today, CBAM is at a crossroads. With a full year of implementation behind us, we have learned some lessons. This test period has shown that decarbonizing international trade will be more complicated than expected. CBAM is even more necessary, but we need to improve it. We need to improve it to make it fully effective. As you know, CBAM will apply in its definitive regime from January 1st, 2026. So 2025 will be a pivotal year. Between now and then, we have critical work to do, and our objectives are clear. First, to ensure that CBAM becomes fully operational by clarifying some key aspects of its implementation. This includes important topics, such as rules for taking into account the carbon price effectively paid abroad, and ensuring robust verification of emissions reporting. This should also include a strong simplification program to ensure that small importers, such as small and medium-sized enterprises, can make full use of the mechanism. Second, we need to reinforce CBAMs, to reinforce its effectiveness in preventing carbon leakage. That includes the export side and downstream sectors. The upcoming CBAM will be key to tackle crucial issues and provide appropriate solutions to be incorporated into the CBAM regulation. Third, we need to prevent circumvention by taking full advantage of the existing provisions of the CBAM regulation to avoid reshuffling resources. And we also need to strengthen the regulation process to this extent. Last but not least, we need to ensure that everyone is on board, within the EU as well as beyond our borders, where we seek to foster a process as smooth as possible. We are fully committed to work closely with our international partners, and I'm glad many of you could join us today in person or online. Our goal is to facilitate CBAM implementation and support global decarbonization efforts. As you can see, we have a lot of crucial and engaging issues at hand. All of them are on the agenda this afternoon. The first roundtable will focus on the main lessons learned from CBAM so far. Then we will look at potential evolutions of the CBAM regulation. These evolutions, I would like to give you more details on them. First, the possible extension to additional products, including downstream products. Second, the risk of carbon leakage on the export side. Third, the crucial risks of circumvention and the issue of resource shuffling. And fourth, the potential inclusion of the indirect emissions in the longer term. Finally, we will delve into the issue of cooperation with our international partners on carbon pricing. We will discuss initiatives to support third countries in their decarbonization efforts, as well as work underway in other jurisdictions to design and implement carbon markets and border adjustments. Now let me conclude. In their seminal report, published in May 2023, Jean Pisani-Ferry and Selma Mahfouz raised the question of the economic implication of climate action. The authors show that it is difficult for green capitalism and fossil capitalism to coexist. It's difficult to make them coexist within an open trading framework. This is a major challenge for global economic governance over the next decade. We are facing it right now. In a world where not all countries are decarbonizing at the same pace, and where our citizens expect us to maintain a level playing field, we need to invent, to develop, and to implement new policy tools. CBAM is the first of these tools, and I hope a prototype for innovative mechanisms. New instruments need to be designed and implemented, and it is now up to the new European Commission to do this in the context of the forthcoming Clean Industrial Deal. In doing so, we will find a way to durably reconcile decarbonization and international trade, both of which are essential to our future. Moving CBAM forward and making it work is a major step forward in ensuring the continued effectiveness of the Paris Agreement. We are at a time where this agreement is being challenged more than ever. So let's act now. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Thank you, Minister. It's my pleasure now to invite for the second keynote speech Mr. Gerasimos Thomas, Director General of DG Taxud. On a personal note, I have rarely seen somebody taking with so much enthusiasm and commitment to put together a very difficult piece of legislation. Gerasimos.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you here and all of you online. Thank you very much to the French Ministry of Economic and Treasury for organizing this meeting. I think it's very important to have around here both the private sector, but also I think a number of national competent authorities that are meeting here today, and they also continue their discussions together on more technical level tomorrow. I think it's extremely important the people who actually deal with CBAM on the ground are particular guests, and we usually meet them online, so it's very good to meet them in person, you know. And I think it's very good that they meet each other in person, and this is a unique occasion. So I think a lot of things have happened since CBAM was officially adopted and signed after the negotiations. Many of you followed this from the distance during the negotiations. Others were implicated. But I think now it is a moment that we have, let's say, 5 quarters of data and different interactions that have taken at all levels. And I think it's a good moment at the beginning of this year to take stock of where we are, to share information with you, and see, as the minister said, what is the way forward. So we are pleased from the European Commission, who run, let's say, the CBAM registry and the implementing regulation. These are sort of 2 of the implementing acts that they have already been adopted, and the CBAM registry is one essential tool that brings everybody, you know, around one central system. I think it is important to see how the information that we are collecting for this transition period is developing. As you know, we had the first period that the information for the declarants was fairly loose. The methodology was very easy to compile, and then gradually this methodology is tightening up. The type of information that different actors, importers have to provide has been gradually harmonized in 3 steps. I think we are pleased to see that, you know, on the technical side, the registry works. We have received in the first 4 quarters over 1 million of individual entries. This does not mean importers, but just to see that the size of the exercise and the granularity of the data. And we see that over time we have seen an increase in the number of declarants who provide actual emissions and actual values versus default values. It is important because to see at the actual values and how it works in practice, because as the minister said, we are here to prevent carbon leakage, and an essential input in order to measure carbon leakage, to decide how it works, is to know what are, you know, what is the CO2 content of the products that come from outside the union, inside the union. You all must be now familiar from the fact that the four core sectors of CBAM, steel, aluminum, fertilizers, and cement, they're also electricity and hydrogen, but the core sectors of CBAM are goods on which, at the moment, Europe has significant production in these sectors, but also significant imports. And overall, we are net importers in these goods overall, more than 100 million tons, you know, every year over the last 4 years. So it's an area that, you know, it's not that we don't have imports. We do have imports. We have an internal market that in these sectors requires imports, but we need to monitor, you know, the CO2 content of embedded in these imports, and we need to make sure that we treat our producers equally with those that, you know, with our imports, and in order to avoid the carbon leakage. So I think it is important to see that the so-called CBAM methodology that was very much discussed, you know, when the CBAM exercise was launched, it is being used. And in fact, EU importers have increased almost 8 times since the mid-2022 until the last year, the reliance on actual data versus default values. In the beginning, everybody was trying to use default values. It was easier, but it has gone up tremendously. And we see in particular that big importers, those that have more than 1,000 tons of CO2 emissions or 10,000 tons of CO2 emissions, the imports that are big are very well prepared, and in their majority they report let's say, emissions, embedded emissions on the basis of the so-called CBAM methodology. For these big importers, the reporting on the basis of CBAM methodology is 11 times higher than the average, and we do know, and I will come to that, we have a number of small importers. So we have also seen that the registry, apart from the first 3 weeks in the beginning of last year that we had, we're trying to get everybody to be familiar on how it works. I think we managed now to have a smooth running of the registry. New features have been included in the registry so that it doesn't, it works and it's easy to use, and we took on board comments of the different participants. It collects a lot of data, and it has given us already a certain insight on what is going on in this market. I think this insight has been, let's say, complemented with the regular discussions that my services and the member states, the national competent authorities had with the industry on the ground. Insights that we have from third countries. There has been engagement with third countries, either through conferences or bilateral meetings, a number of bilateral meetings with both big and small exporters. And finally, last but not least, we do have regular working groups in a very transparent way, involving stakeholders, involving third countries. The objective is to be totally transparent on what we measure, what is the value added of this measurement, what is the risk that we are trying to cover, and a lot of additional input has been integrated already during this transition period. Now, where we are now, we have found out that certain of the inputs that we have received cannot be integrated in what we call secondary legislation, this implementing acts, delegated acts, for those that you are a bit Brussels specialist, but it's a secondary legislation you have in all member states. So some of it requires, let's say, intervention, going back to the original legislation in order to take some suggestions into account. And I think our strategy has three let's say, steps going forward. The first step is to have a certain simplification measures in the way by which CBAM that will apply as of the 1st of January 2026, so to make sure that the administrative burden, particularly for, let's say, occasional and small importers, is alleviated. Second, it is that we have to finish a more comprehensive review of the data of this transition period, complemented by a number of detailed studies on which we ran public consultations during this year, and then come to specific proposals on how to align the scope, expand the scope of the CBAM as it is required by the regulation. We have to see not in every sector, that industrial sector, but they have to see in what is called in our legislation energy-intensive sectors. It's a very limited number of sectors, primarily beyond the sectors that we have, chemicals, petrochemicals, paper and pulp, so they are more CN codes for those of you that are specialists, but they are around these sectors. Then we have to look at the downstream products, and to the degree that they need or they not need to be integrated into the CBAM mechanism, depending on the, let's say, the content, carbon content that the sectors have, the trade intensity and the administrative burden. We need to look at indirect emissions, and we need to calculate, if there is any impact on the exporting sector. So all this work, it is done from now to the end of this year. We expect to finalize all these assessments, both the dive-in assessment and all the additional studies and come with a report to the Council, to the Parliament, to the industrial community in the autumn of 2025, so that we have an additional discussion before legislating again next year. The legal text will come in 2026. I think this shows the method by which we work, but it also shows that it is still an important time over the next 3 quarters to receive your feedback. Wherever you are sitting, on whichever part, either in the administration, I see some of the colleagues here, or because the pressure is also on administration, including the administrative burden that there is, the industry, the specific companies, the traders, all of you. So we still have intensive engagement to do. Some of you are particularly interested in the simplifications that we will do. I think we will propose them now in a couple of weeks. We are still designing and adjusting with the other, let's say, within the Commission, the College of Commissioners, different aspects, but we will have a new de minimis rule. It has been a lot of debate, and you know, as to whether the existing de minimis of 150 euros de minimis has served as well. And it seems that it's, you know, we have. If we look at CBAM as what it is, an environmental measure, so if we care about the CO2 emissions, we see that we have a lot of reporting requirements that do not bring up return in CO2 terms. It's a return on investment. So we invest a lot and then we get lit. So I think we can substantially, let's say, relieve a certain number of what now in the period are declarants from this administrative burden, because they deal with the very low levels of CO2. So we argue in terms of CO2 and not in terms of money, because they are different products, and in the future it will be more products. And I think this will be something that will address the needs of the importers, of the exporters, of different actors, the administration, and allow us to focus where the real carbon leakage is. Second, we look at the authorization process that has to be ready before 2026. And some of you have been giving us feedback of all the actors on this. We will have a different, very important work stream is the simplification of the method of calculation of the embedded emissions. You know, we do hear that, you know, this unique method, even if I said in the beginning, people are following this, you know, it can be simplified. It can be based more on methods that the industry is using already for other purposes. So we will not lose the content. For those of you that rightly, like us, are focusing on the CO2 content, we will not need the substance of measuring embedded CO2 emissions, but we can do it by better combining data from existing processes and standards. And then we will also deal from our discussions, and we are getting valuable feedback on how we can simplify the financial guarantees associated with the border measure. Is a border measure. Some of you, I've just spent the morning speaking to the French customs, who will also be, you know, and there is some burden around this. The third step, I gave you the 2 steps. So the first is the simplifications, the next is the expansion, and then the third step is very much on how to make sure that what we make, it works. There is no counterfeiting, there is no resource shuffling. So it's a very essential package of making sure that the system is tight. We will focus where the risk is, instead of focusing on anybody, but where the risk is, we are going to control, hence my discussion with the customs this morning, but I'm going to all the countries, and I had all the regional customs directors from France. So every port, every airport were present to understand how it will work. So I want to thank you for engaging, and I'm looking forward to listen to and discuss with some of my fellow panelists, answer your questions. But I think it is my message to you is that this year is still a year that your input, at least let's say the first 3 quarters, It's a year by which we need to engage and make this mechanism more efficient for everybody, serving the general interest of Europe and of the world. We have now 74 countries around the world using carbon pricing and carbon pricing systems. This was double the number, or we had half before, of countries thinking of introducing some type of a carbon pricing system. So in terms at international level, it is also a big success for us to have this wide, let's say, usage of carbon pricing around the world. Thank you.
Gerasimos, I think that I didn't want to make you go to come back, but okay. Look, please have a seat because I'm inviting the first panel for the first session. The first thing I have to say is that in the fog of war, all plans go to hell. In this case, I was supposed to be the man who keeps the trains running on time, and I can tell you right now, this is more Deutsche Bahn than Shinkansen, so it's okay. Session one is lessons learned from the first year of the implementation of the CBAM. I think Director General Gerasimos Thomas have gone through a number of things, but it's an opportunity to discuss key figures of the CBAM declaration, the implementation of the CBAM by member states, and the reporting of emissions from covered goods by the European importers and industries. And the panel that we have is, again, Director General Thomas, Luisa Santos, who's the Deputy Director General of Business Europe. Luisa, welcome. Renaud Battier, who is the co-chair of Aegis Europe and Director General Ceramini. And last but not least, Mark Bressers, the Director of the Dutch Emission Authority, NEA. So welcome. We will... yeah, the mics work, so there's no surprises there. Okay, so the way we'll do this, I will ask some questions, and I'm obliged by necessity at this point. It's not by choice that I'm going to have to be very strict in terms of time. So I will ask the panelists to really try to keep to 3-4 minutes, or else we're going to be grossly over time. And I also have to tell you this, that I don't have any leeway at the end of the day because there's another minister, and the ministers are very punctual, so please bear with me. So, Gerasimos, again, thank you very much for this expose and the things that are coming up, obviously on the mind of a lot of people here, whether they being industry or other stakeholders, very important for all of us. First question that I would look is, looking back at 1 year of CBAM, what is the state of implementation? What are your key takeaways? And can you run us a little bit through the key figures of the first year of implementation? Because you have now numbers, there's something that's not hypothetical anymore. You're beginning to have data to put on the table. So could you give us some of these conclusions after the first year?
I think I covered most of the issues. I think at the general level, we cannot go to all details in the introductory. So I think that for us, the fact is that the methodology and actual values are, being used. And it seems that the CBAM methodology, it is usable, particularly much more by the bigger players than the small players. But at the end of the day, as you will see on the simplification package is, let's say, revealed that we will not need in CO2 terms to worry as much about the occasional importers, the small importers. So I think, and we can still improve the methodology that it is being used and simplified, but nevertheless, we have something that allows us, what I like to say to my people is we can count. And the industry counts as well. And the industry counts if it is the cement industry in Egypt, or the steel industry in India, or the aluminum industry in Turkey, or so. So we can count, and we can have numbers on which we can base our decisions. And we have no delays on the IT system. We have managed to ensure confidentiality of data. This was a concern primarily of third countries, that they could, through the registry, they had to share data with importers that they didn't want to share. So we dealt with this and we created a special possibility for confidential information not to be shared through the importers, but directly with the registry. And I think this has relieved a lot of the pressure points and that we have received. So, but it's good to probably ask the other panelists.
But the numbers, the reporting, the numbers that you're getting, can you give us any window on that? Are you getting the reports at the level that you were hoping for? Is this an issue? Is it becoming an issue at all so far?
No, I think we have an increasing number. We have a risk management system for CBAM by which we can check I said we have about 500,000 registrations. This doesn't mean 500,000 imports, but we monitor very closely per sector, per country of import, and also for country of origin. So we have all the data around sector, quantities, all this. The numbers are going up, and they are comparable and back-checked with the customs data. So I think we have established a system that when the minister said we need a system on which we can adjust, we have a system by which we can verify, so to speak, that there is a good tightness on the numbers as they come.
Yeah, let me turn back now to Mark. Netherlands, Rotterdam, big port, a lot of gateway to Europe. Can you tell us a little bit from your point of view as CBAM National Competent Authority, how's this year been? What are the operational tasks that you're responsible? I think probably quite a few people know here, and I think probably it takes more than 3 minutes to go through it. But what are the main challenges? I mean, at the end, after a year, you're beginning to figure out what the problem is.
Well, those are a lot of questions, of course, but
yeah,
you have time, haven't you?
I said that when we look at them, but do the best you can.
I'll try. Well, maybe first of all, I suppose today we will talk a lot about what can go better and where we can improve processes. And tomorrow, a lot of competent authorities are here also to exchange ideas. I think the first thing what comes to mind is that it's very exciting to work on this project, because we have a chance to create a level playing field for sustainable industry. It's new at all. We have to learn a lot. But, the first thing is exciting. It's challenging, and we work with a lot of bright people, my own colleagues, colleagues with the European Commission. We have very good relations, also other member states. So first of all, because we don't want to be negative, it's really exciting. Maybe having said that, it's also a bumpy road. It's new, and I can remember, for instance, maybe to say my organization, the Dutch Emission Authority, is also responsible for the ETS, broadening the ETS, the new methane directive, but also a lot of implementations, regulation on energy, on renewable energy. So we see how a lot of regulation comes together with us, with my organization, but also within private corporations, importers. So we see a lot of, stifling of regulation. And I can, for instance, remember the first deadline. It was in January when the portal opened. It wasn't ready yet, and hopefully it's now. But, we had a good tradition in the Netherlands of being a very good implementer, little questions, and then, the telephones went on and on. So a lot of, and that's, I think, the key. A lot of organizations, we need to comply to the CBAM. They want to be compliant. And if we don't give the opportunity to be compliant, they get very anxious, and they should do so. So I think if you ask me now, and we can elaborate on that, what are the biggest challenges? Is that on the one hand, we want to create this CBAM system which is reliable and which we can trust. And on the other hand, the only way to gain trust is that it's a system which is also doable, where the administrative burdens are proportional, when we can say to the importers, this is what you need to do to comply. And I think that's not easy, because it's all new to us. I think we are, of course, we are the first to work on a CBAM. And well, therefore, it's good that we are here today. We're here to learn, and I think we have to learn. I think we have to be honest on what we know and what we don't know, share our insecurities, and learn from one another. So those are my challenges, so to say.
Well, it's a new world, but we all knew that trade is going to become one of the main issues coming forward. And I don't need to tell you, I wake up every morning and we hear something new about trade in the newspapers. But that's a different story. Now, I'll turn to Luisa Santos and Renaud, and they'll answer in the order that they want to answer. But the question really is, what are the key takeaways from this year as a business federation, and what are the main challenges identified by businesses and CBAM-covered industry in implementing the EU CBAM? Luisa, of course, you're the deputy at Business Europe. Renaud, you are also co-chair of Aegis, but also run Ceramuni, so you a very precise and very technical details that you'll know in your own business. Luisa, you start? Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon to everyone. Yeah, I would also call it exciting, but also extremely challenging, to say the least, because the objective of this measure is to try to help assist companies while ensuring that we have a level playing field on trade, but also ensuring that we are able to decarbonize without losing competitiveness in Europe. And the third objective is to ensure that more countries adopt a carbon pricing. So this is the challenge we have. And the question for us is whether the measure as it is now, and we know we are still in the implementation phase, is effective or not. I think we must not forget that this measure is very much linked to the ETS, to the emission trading system, and the fact that we are, of course, also phasing out the free allocations within the emissions trading system. So this is very important because it is a huge, important factor to measure the competitiveness of the European industry and the carbon leakage question. One of the things we always said as business is, if CBAM is not proved to be effective, we need to reconsider the idea of phasing out the free allocations. I think this has always been one key aspect for us. And then the question of the administrative burden, because of course we have the administrative burden on the Commission, on the competent authorities, but above all, we have the administrative burden on companies. And while this is not only the only measure where companies need to report and need to present data. So I think the main aspect for us at the moment in terms of implementation is ensuring that we reduce and simplify some of the reporting requirements. And I think the Commission is well aware of this because we have made a questionnaire and we came out with concrete recommendations. So reducing the reporting requirements while ensuring that the measure remains effective. And I think if we target, indeed, most of the emissions, even if they correspond to a limited number of importers, that is already a key factor, while ensuring that we maintain a good effectiveness and control also possible circumvention.
Renaud, if Business Europe is a broad church, you also co-chair of Aegis.
Thank you. So yes, thank you very much, André. As Aegis, so our focus is really on the fair competition in trade. This is the motto of Aegis Europe, which was created in 2015 and gathers several manufacturing. So we really represent European manufacturers of steel, aluminum, fertilizers, ceramics, and many other, and papers and many other products. And we want to have fair competition. So when we look at CBAM, we look at whether indeed we can have this balance. In terms of challenges that we can see, the first ones we're thinking of is some of the things that should have been included from the beginning, but were not. So we are always worried about circumvention, about resource shuffling. We are worried about the impact of not having already designed a solution for exports from the beginning. And here, these things, they really have to be fixed within the next 6 months. That will be our message. Because otherwise it would be a bloodshed. We can see, I think you all read the paper, so you know in the energy-intensive industries what is the impact today. in terms of level playing field. We are suffering from what we could call environmental dumping. Many sectors have reduced by more than 30% since 2021. And it's going to accelerate with the price of gas that we are seeing today, that is coming close to 60 megawatts. So we are really entering everyday dangerous area. And of course, we can discuss simplification, but really our focus is to maintain. If we simplify, we have to ensure that it does not create more risk of unreliability, of fraud, etc.
Yeah, Luisa, let's coming back just to be a more precise, if you want more focused question, what would recommendation be? I'm going to have to shorten because I'm grossly running out of time. What are the recommendations to facilitate and enhance the collection of actual data emissions from suppliers located outside the EU? This is a challenge. I tell you what, I come from the Middle East. I came from the Gulf right now, and they're in a state of quasi-panic because they don't know what they're doing. So what do you think? What do you find out?
Well, I think one aspect is, of course, making sure we inform correctly operators in third countries. And I think this the Commission has been doing, companies have been trying to do. But of course, supply chains are extremely complex today. And by the way, they are shifting. They are shifting now, and we will see more in the near future. So this makes the whole process more complex. So if you reduce the number of companies that need to report these emissions, of course, if you are concentrating the reports, if you are concentrating those that have to provide the data on a few, the ones that report more data, you are already helping in collecting more precise data. I think it is important as well that we simplify the methodology. I think this could be a possibility. But the important thing is to ensure that we have ways of verifying this data. I'm happy to hear that you have more and more actual data being reported because, of course, one of the things that we were asking to simplify is that during the transition period, we have default values. The possibility to present default values, because of course we need to make sure that we have the mechanism in place to have actual data that is accurate. Because the worst we can have is because in this phase it will determine also the future phases if we don't have accurate data. The de minimis was an issue. So I do hope that we find a solution also to make sure that we concentrate actually on products where you have high carbon content, because that is creating a lot of problems for reporting companies, but also for the authorities. Just one final point is on the downstream and the export side. We need to ensure that we are thoroughly assessing also the impact on downstream sectors. And I think this is one of the big questions going ahead, is if we are enlarging the scope of the mechanism, potentially we will have more companies being forced to of course, to produce reports. So we need to make sure as well that we have a good balance here between the obligations of the companies and the effectiveness of the measures. So this is important. And final point, I would say we have to simplify and make and have more consistency between the customs projects and the customs systems that are already there. For instance, the authorized economic operators and the CBAM. This is very important to simplify also the procedure.
I think, Renaud, Luisa kind of stole your thunder a little bit, but we already had a discussion last week a bit about simplification. Maybe you want to highlight some of the main points.
Looking also focusing on the effectiveness, one point that we want to make is on the online platform, which has been very welcome and is working. But there we think it's extremely important to encourage as much as possible, not the importers, but the exporting producers to complete the data themselves about their value chain, to increase reliability and to have as much as possible a shift of the responsibility. But it will be easier to verify if it's well enforced or not if the exporters are entering the data. Then we have an issue on precursors. So precursors that are made in EU, we exported, for example, in the UK, and then we imported in Europe. There is clearly double reporting and the risk for double taxation if the reporting has a mistake. And there it should, when you are re-importing a precursor which is made in the EU, then it should be 0. And for the de minimis, so of course it has to be feasible, and there is some value in increasing the de minimis and maybe also increasing some CO2 content, but it has to be well implemented and well designed so that you maintain the fairness between the different competitors. And what we also say is that this is helping the importers, that's fine, but when we are talking about the scope, we will need a thorough assessment about when we are enlarging, increasing the scope horizontally to different sectors. We also need to keep in mind the burden for SMEs, not only for the importers, but also for the European producers.
Very well. I'm now kind of the same question, Mark, to you from your point of view. I mean, you're dealing with all this stuff coming through your ports and borders and planes. What's your lesson, or what do you see? How do you see simplification?
Well, for us, the key to simplification is de minimis, de minimis, de minimis. Hiring the threshold. And I know, of course, the questions you have, how do we prevent circumvention? But when we look at our data, for instance, what we had gathered over the last year, 3% of the biggest importers are responsible for more than 95% of all the embedded carbon. So that is the balance we're dealing with. So, and that's under the current threshold. So I think there's a lot of arguments as well towards organizations like mine, the CBA, but also to SMEs, to the industry, that a higher threshold would really be very helpful, would create trust, and make this a system where the administrative burdens are more proportional in relation to the public value. So that would be my first, advice and my wish. And we are very thankful that we have had good conversation on this topic with the European Commission, very detailed. And I'm confident that there will be a solution to also the questions you have in that field. Maybe second, smaller point, and I'm glad you mentioned that too. That's the authorization process, because 25 is not only an important year because of all the questions concerning simplification, how do we deal with broadening the CBAM later on, but from the 1st of January next year, all the importers will have to be authorized. And that will be for us a huge endeavor. We can't make mistakes, and we want to also provide a clear path towards all the importers, of course, what do they have to do to be compliant. So I think we need time for that. And third, and I hadn't heard the word yet, is outreach. We have learned over the last year, we can talk about all the details here, but in the end, it's all about explaining to the importers, to the business organization involved, where can they go with their questions? And I think 99% of all our energy now is related to outreach. And I think that's not only outreach to the businesses themselves, but also towards us. We need also the involvement and the help from business organizations, very important to us, and we are very helpful to them. But also outreach to other competent authorities, to the European Commission, because, we have a lot to learn. And, we have to stay together.
Thank you. So we listen to intervention from national authority and to business representative. I can tell you there's nobody here from aluminum, because we would have heard about scrap if it was aluminum here, but we didn't hear that. And I'm not going to say exports, because I think Gerasimos is very allergic when I say the word exports. No, I'm joking, because he knows I pound on that all that. It's passion of my life. But Gerasimos, I think you've addressed in your initial remarks, and as well as your initial intervention, the things that I have in my question, the main challenges faced by the Commission, the lessons learned, and what changes will the Commission propose?
Don't read your questions, Andre.
I think you're, but it's more of an opportunity to say any other thing you want to say.
No, I think it's important. Unfortunately, I have to leave. Otherwise, as you know, I can sit here and answer any single question that you have. I spent 4 hours in the WTO. They were down to death every ambassador, 81 ambassadors. I can sit there and exhaust you. I think, and I want to say a few things. First of all, we have a great team, and you will have with Elena Skopio in the next panel, and the colleagues that are here, some of them are here, they will be able formally and informally to answer a lot of questions. I want to say that there is an international discussions about border measures, and I think Fabrizia Pecorella in this third panel, in the Secretary General of the OECD, she will have to tell us about, even if we are in a new geopolitical environment, that our borders are, are discussed in a different way. I think it is essential, the work that the OECD is doing in the IFCMA in order to do this counting the route way, I think, and have a lot of methodologies and complement what we do perfectly, as you know. But I think, and being subject to peer pressure by other institutions with very straight methodological standards, that is very important. So we should not be inward looking on this. And I'm happy also that we have representatives from third countries, from companies here. So I think I would say to my colleagues here on the right, on the Business Europe, you propose in your paper six measures to simplify. I will give you 3 times as much. So, I'm confident in 2 weeks. I cannot tell you now exactly what I will do because, the people think to be approved, but I am going to surprise you on the upside. On the other side, I think I will try to, let's say, to dispute a couple of comments that you both have said. CBAM is not an instrument and a policy tool for all things. Let's say you're all probably interested here on CBAM, but CBAM alone cannot do all these things that you say. The leakage, the level playing field, the administrative burden, more investment, more competitive, for God's sake. CBAM is a bit of a product that has a little bit better brand, that it should, it's a little bit more sexy. The name, I don't know, it doesn't, even the French are using the word CBAM instead of, I don't recall the French initials, but, it cannot solve all these problems. So there are other tools in the Green Deal, as you say, the way the ETS reforms. And I think we as Commission now, because we are listening to the industry, you will see, in the Clean Industry Deal, we will try to address some of the competitiveness problems that you give. So we fully agree with you on the challenges that you as industry put this, but allow us as policymakers to choose the tool. Some solutions, will be through the CBAM, some will be through other components of the Clean Industry Deal. Do not overcharge the debate on every tool, because one tool cannot solve the problems that we have. The last issue that I would say, and I think it would be useful to discuss, there is this, Andre, you say people, and you told me before, I'm not going to mention, for every government official in a third country that says to me, oh, my industry does not know how to count emissions, and they are lost or something, I find, 15 companies in the same country that can do it. CBAM is addressed to companies. It's not addressed to officials in ministries in third countries. So if they cannot count, be my guest, the industry, the companies, they can count. So I think what it will not go away from the simplification is that we need, to the right degree, we need to know our suppliers. The big companies, I'm not saying the occasional carpenter that buys nails, to fix a box or do a small work, but the big customers need to know their suppliers. There is a big, and they want to know their suppliers. Okay, there is a big automotive company that I know. They buy aluminum from 2 countries. Now they will change and they switch to one supplier because the one makes a cleaner, cleaner aluminum than the other. So you need to know your customer into it. It's a matter of competitiveness if you know your supply chain. It's also a matter of geopolitical and economic security, increasingly. We didn't think about this 2 years ago, but as of today, you need to know your supply chain. And I think it's important, and it is important from whom exports and who imports. And I can assure you, I have met people making outside Europe, there are extremely high quality, low embedded emissions cement suppliers in countries outside Europe, and we should learn from them and vice versa. So I think it's very important to know our suppliers. I think last comment on NCAs, I think they have been doing a wonderful job, the national authorities. As in the Netherlands, 20 countries have chosen as a national authority the ETS authority, and 7 have chosen Ministry of Finance authorities. None of you can do it alone. So you need to make sure at the national level that you work together with your customs and other authorities at the border. And the ones who have chosen the customs, they can also not do it alone. They need to work together with environmental authorities. So for those of you from government, you need to bring and bank some heads together in your authorities, because not in every country they speak to each other to the degree that they should speak together. It is fine here, but if you go around the 27, there needs to be much better cooperation of the authorities in order to avoid the risks that you mentioned, and I think to work with industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerasimos. And when I said he's a very, very dedicated and very, very passionate about this, there we have it. I mean, it is not a passionate speech. I don't know what it is. So, look, I have a problem, and the problem is time. I can make many things. I can't make time. I was told that, again, we have a hard stop at 5 o'clock, and that's about, or 5:15. Is the Slido on? Are we putting the Slido on? I think that people can ask a question, but via the Slido. I think there's time for one question, and that's about the best I can do. Otherwise, we're going to fall badly out of time. So, if you want to type the question in very quickly, I'll pick one and try and ask the panelists to react to it. But again, so I'm looking at my iPad, which is presumably connected to internet, and trying to see if there's any questions. But I don't see anything so far. And if I don't see anything in the next 30 seconds, I move to the next panel. Well, I have an anonymous question. I don't like anonymous questions, but I have an anonymous question. I think Gerasimos, it predictably is going to have to be to you, because the question is, what are the threshold to determine small versus large importer? And then there's a next question, we can all answer it. What are you working with third countries about aligning CBAM requirements if they implement their own CBAM? So I think Gerasimos, Volens, Nolens, I think it's you.
The first question, I know, but I cannot tell you. So, so it is still some to this. You can guess. You see, the press has different things, but I cannot officially tell you. I'm an official. There has to be a decision, a formal decision, but and then we can discuss it. But on the second discussion, I think it forms part of what I mentioned: international engagement. We discuss internationally through the OECD, through the Climate Club, whoever. There are different initiatives to decide how to coordinate carbon pricing at an international level, how to have embedded emissions. That is the most difficult issue. And I think that's where IFCMA has the more technical expertise on how to calculate in a consistent way across the world embedded emissions. And they are not developing any methodologies. They are comparing them and looking at best practices. And I think on the border measures on the different countries, we do not have any kind of, we are sharing the experience with all the countries that they have to do it, they want to do it. I think, and they come from all sorts of parts of the world. There is, obviously, the UK has made public consultation, or Australia has made, but also there are countries like India, Morocco, different countries from different sort of level of development. They are facing the potential of carbon leakage, and we are sharing our experience with all of them. We don't have a doctrine. We discussed there has been US initiatives, even if not the US government is not probably, but I think we are sharing this experience to the degree we can. Thank you.
In terms of enforcement, I mean, we are at the end of February and the time flies. In terms of enforcement, you want to comment, Mark, on enforcement? Who would like to comment on that?
First, I wanted to confirm this point, the third party influence, because over the last 2 years, we didn't only spend on energy on CBAM itself, but also delegations from third countries visiting us as a national authority and asking, how do you set up an ETS? So that's... and it's a direct effect of the CBAM. They are emitting that too. So that's also a positive signal we receive within third countries about the CBAM. In the case of enforcement, well, what we've done over the last year is give more emphasis on outreach, on communication, on saying we are in this phase of learning. And enforcement will be something which will level up with the amount of clarity within the regulation, the amount of commitment and compliancy. But as an NCA, we in the first year we deliberately also to create trust, give more energy towards communication, and we think that's a good choice.
Luisa, you wanted, but a very short clip because I really have to move on.
On third countries engaging and implementation, I think what we also need to look into is to the countries that have an ETS and are introducing a CBAM, and we have one, for instance, with the UK, that we really need to decide what we're going to do. Because I think ideally we should be linking the systems, and ideally we should be avoiding that companies pay twice. And this is very important because otherwise we are creating market fragmentation and we are also creating more and more costs for our companies. So this is an important factor also in the engagement and implementation vis-a-vis third countries.
And of course there's the 800-pound gorilla, the man who likes tariffs, how he's going to react to all this. So I'm going to stop here and thank Gerasimos, Luisa, Renaud, and Mark, and thank you very, very much. I apologize for having to rush people. I mean, this is our discussion. I know, Gerasimos, you are very open and like to discuss this. I think there are a lot of questions from the floor and from everywhere. But I'd like to thank you and try to invite the next panel. So join me in thanking the panels, please. So I will invite the next panel up now. Invite the next panel up is Maria Elena Scoplio, the Director for Indirect Taxation and Tax Administration at DG Taxud. Olivier Brault, who is the President of the Federation of European Cookware, Cutlery, Houseware Industry, and Vice President for Public Affairs at Group SEB. Frauke Thies, Executive Director at Agora Think Tank. Adrienne Assous, who is the Executive Director at Sandbag. And last but not least, my good friend and colleague, Michael Melling, who's the Deputy Director at the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at MIT, and I also will claim he's on the board of ERCST because I have to say that. But I'm not sure whether Michael is there. I cannot tell that. I hope that the organizer can confirm that that is the case. Now, this panel, if you think that these panels are actually going to keep to what they want to say, you're kidding. Because, you know, obviously, a lot of people in the first panel had to say something about what's happening in the second panel and in the third panel. But this panel deals with what evolutions of the CBAM are expected in the coming years. That question has popped up. Now, you know, we have a different cast of characters. So we will look at possible future evolution of the CBAM regulation, including work on extending the mechanism in additional sectors, downstream sectors, risk of carbon leakage to export, risk of circumvention, inclusion of indirect emissions, etc., etc. There is one thing that comes to my mind. The first thing that comes to my mind in this thing is that we have a simplification package and then we have a review, and how these two things will fit together. But let's move on and go to our question. The first question would be to Maria Elena. Can you present the ongoing work of the Commission on CBAM and the calendar and possible initiative to come in the coming months and years in the context of the priorities and strategy of the new Commission? I know that some of it are things that you're not at this point able to talk to, but give us some general lines as to where we're moving.
Yes, good afternoon, first of all, and thanks a lot for being invited here. We are very busy at the moment because we all know that CBAM is supposed to enter into its definitive phase at the beginning of next year. So everything which has left to be done needs to be done now. Gerasimos has mentioned earlier the fact that we're working on the simplifications to the system which is known by everybody in the regulation, and they should be adopted on the 26th of February. At the same time, we are preparing all the other pieces of legislation that are necessary for the entry into force of the definitive regime, so technical issues like how to authorize the people that will have to certify the emissions abroad, and how the sale of certificates is going to work, plus all the work which is going to support the IT behind all the purchase and submission of certificates has to be prepared. We have been tasked as Commission to report on a wide range of issues on the exports, the impact on exports that Gerasimos doesn't want to talk about, the possibility to expand the scope to downstream products, to other sectors that are included in the ETS, the calculation of indirect emissions, but also other issues like the impact on least developed countries. All this is now been analyzed separately. We have tasked internal and external consultants. Internal is the JRC, the Joint Research Center of the Commission, and external we have gone through public procurement assignment of contractors for studies that are analyzing all these different issues. And last but not least, the methodology to calculate the carbon emission, because what we currently know is only an approach to have an idea on how the emissions have to be reported. So different strands of work. We will report on what I said before the end of this year, probably after the summer. And the legal texts that should follow in case they are needed following all these reports will happen in 2026, at the very beginning of 2026. So we can say that we have three parts. The one that is going to be adopted very, very soon, and that will bring simplifications for small, medium, and also for the member states that are supposed to check, and for us and for the importers. The reports on which we will issue some official findings before the end of this year, then the legislative initiatives next year. On top of this, I can simply add that we also envisage to monitor the process of the simplifications in the two-year report that is happening in 2027. So that's going to be a continuous process. It's not a one-off. If there is any space to make it simpler, make it more effective without having to give way to circumvention, we will continuously monitor that. Hope I didn't take too much time.
No, never. The Commission never takes enough time. But Maria Elena, one thing that it's not I'm puzzled, but I'm trying to understand is in the what is the logic of what is going to be included? I'm not asking you to tell me exactly because you're not going to tell me. But what is the kind of the logic, the separation between what's going to be in the simplification package and in the because there's a July review. So that's, just a broad, that can be anything else or else everything else included. So what's the logic, how you separate these two?
Both involve changes to the regulation, and we could have done all this all together. However, we considered that those elements that were bringing up cut of red tape, less administrative burden, should have been put to the knowledge of all the stakeholders as soon as possible to reassure, to be able to target them better, if need be, before the entry into force of the definitive regime. And also because this would have fitted very nicely with the first initiative to simplify that the President von der Leyen has called the Omnibus. So that is going to be part of that as well. The criteria to distinguish the two was to try to look at what was bringing less red tape, was making it easier for all the, not necessarily only the importers or the producer, anybody. Even some simplifications for the NCAs is included. So whatever can be considered and simplification has been anticipated and separated. And the more substantial issues have been pushed forward. Well, actually, they were already foreseen for later. We have anticipated the simplification measures. We have kept the rest for when it was foreseen.
Thank you, Maria-Elena. Let me move on to Olivier Brault. Olivier, you would argue that your sector, your business, your area is more downstream. So, in terms of a question that comes to mind is what might downstream sectors be exposed to risk of carbon leakage? And what is your analysis of the risk of the sectors you represent, and what solution do you recommend in the short term? Olivier?
First of all, Andrei, thank you for having me here on this floor. I'm pretty sure that you didn't have a lot of opportunities to discuss about pot, pans, and knives, future and fate.
I bought my son for Christmas cutlery, so that's okay.
And what I can tell you, the first thing I'd like to tell you is that we are the great forgotten ones of the CBAM mechanism. And even worse, I mean, if we are not included in the Annex 1 and that we include the indirect emissions in the CBAM, some of our companies are going to die. So I don't want to add too much drama to it, but I'm going to explain. Let me explain to you. The first one is our products are very close to the upstream sector. Most of our products do have in between 70 to 90% of metal. Would it be aluminum or would it be inox? Meaning that when the cost of the raw material is going to increase, it's going to fall down on our products entirely or nearly entirely. That's the first point. The second point is we are exposed to the international trade. Our sector is already very delocalized, so there are a lot of importers that are competitors in Europe. But we also, and that's less known, export a lot. Half of our production in Europe is exported outside of the European borders. The third point is that as the cost of our products is going to rise, customers are going to turn to less expensive products because the finished goods are not part of this mechanism, meaning that the imported pan, pots, and knives are going to be less expensive in Europe than the ones we are going to produce in Europe. So you will have a high distortion of competition, meaning that according to our studies, including indirect emissions, we are going to lose, we estimate, a third of our production in Europe. It's going to lead to massive deindustrialization. 15,000, that's just an estimation, but 50,000 jobs are at stake. And worse than that, I mean, because consumers are going to turn on important products, they are going to buy products that are going to be made in less decarbonized environment, meaning that instead of lowering the carbon emissions, you are going to increase them by more than 10%. So for our sector, I mean, just this bad-looking scenario could have an issue. The only one we see is to have our products included in the Annex 1. And if you look at what is already in this Annex 1, you've got screws and bolts, and I would suggest that pots and pans are not that far from this type of products. Thank you.
Merci, Olivier, merci. I'm turning now to I hope he's there. He's in Washington, and I hope he's there. I can't see him on the screen. Mike Melling, are you there, Mike?
I'm here, Andre. Can you hear me?
Well, it sounds like a Zoom call on Tuesday afternoon. Mike, welcome. It's not that early for you, so you must be wide awake by now. What factors, a question that I would have to you is, what factors should guide the assessment of the risk of carbon leakage for downstream sector, and what solutions do you see could tackle these problems? Mike, now I can see you on the screen. Good to see you.
Likewise, Andre, good seeing you, and thanks to the organizers also for having me here. So as Olivier said, I think it's clear that we must take seriously and address the leakage of downstream substitution or leakage in downstream and value chains, and it's a risk that we can't ignore. And I think it's also fair to say it's intrinsic to any kind of policy instrument whose application depends on covered thresholds or inclusion thresholds. You'll always have some issues at that threshold. So I'll take the liberty, Andre, you'll probably be happy to hear, to mention that ERCSD, we've been working on this issue, and we came up with observations and some recommendations for how to make, such an assessment in a report that was released last October. And first, we identified that there are, of course, some risks of doing so. There are some challenges. So setting a new threshold, moving that threshold from where it is now in the CBAM regulation in the annex that goes further downstream does bring the possibility that eventually you might start including goods that are not really genuinely at risk of leakage. And there's another, let's say, more technical and economic challenge, that the further downstream you go in any value chain, the more you start seeing an increased imbalance between the costs of the expansion of the scope and the benefits of doing so. And why is that? Because the further downstream you go, embedded carbon and the cumulative carbon costs, and thus also the risk of carbon leakage, tend to decrease relative to the total value of the goods. So as the goods become more complex with higher added value, the embedded carbon cost does decline. And at the same time, you have, of course, increasing administrative burdens of implementation for the competent authorities that have to enforce and supervise and oversee this, but also especially for the producers of such goods. They grow, so the burden can grow rather quickly and eventually could be disproportionate to the benefits of expanding downstream. So there must be a sweet spot somewhere, and identifying that sweet spot is, of course, the challenge. Ultimately, it's a political decision. I think we have to be honest about that, but it can and should be guided by objective criteria. So if prevention of leakage, which is the goal of the CBAM, it should also be the goal of an expansion further downstream of the CBAM. And that assessment should consider the administrative burden, the complexity of compliance, and has to go sector by sector, product by product. It should also, and really needs to consider potential substitution effects across different goods covered by the CBAM, or specific methodological challenges in determining carbon intensities or carbon leakage risk in particular sectors and for particular products. For instance, in petrochemicals, there really are still some methodological challenges there. So in sum, and sort of to sum up, I'd say there's no easy or quick solutions. Identifying the right threshold will require very thorough or comprehensive impact assessment, and it should be a continuous review process because circumstances evolve, of course, change. Technological progress makes new decarbonization options available in different sectors for specific products. So this is a never-ending process. But I understand, and we just heard from Director General Thomas that the CBAM regulation calls for such a review, and the Commission is currently engaged in exactly that kind of assessment.
Well, if I wanted to, Mike, and thank you very much for that. I think that, on the other hand, this is not for the faint of heart. This is serious business, and I'm not in business anymore, but what I do know is that once you lose an account, it's very difficult to get it back. So playing a poker with this is not a great idea, and I for one would err on the conservative side. Now, this is not necessarily the most interactive, but in this case, it happens to be interactive because I turn back to you. What do you think are the challenges? In this case, it's things like complexity of value chains, export, and attribution of emission to scrap, which is a big issue for some people in this room.
Yeah, I guess that one of the key challenges is quite obvious. I mean, we had the DG Taxud here explaining that the CBAM has been designed through the lens of climate change only, And competitiveness, I mean, is not clearly yet in the mind of all the European commissioners. That's my feeling. I mean, we know that now that they are going to move in this direction and they are going to do a better job than before on competitiveness. I mean, but it's key for us because if we are all delocalized, I mean, CBAM will be worthless in some ways. You know? Second of the challenge we have is that nothing has been planned for exports. I mean, even if we are part of the Annex 1, our products are going to be way more expensive at the export than they are today. So we have to find a compensation mechanism to make sure that our products will be able to be competitive even outside of our borders. So you've got the inward processing, which is already existing, could be one of the leads that we could be followed to make sure that we are still competitive outside of our borders in some ways. Complexity is one of it. You mentioned it. It's not the case for us because our products are kind of simple, but if you take, I don't know, a coffee machine, more parts, or a car, plenty of parts, and of course, more parts, more suppliers, a myriad of people that you have to on board in your CBAM process, meaning more reporting, more trust, and then it goes to the circumvention, you know, how do you make sure that all these declarations are trustable? You know, how do you make sure that the products that are declared under one specific HS code are indeed in this HS code? When you look at the flow of products that are coming in our harbors and ports, it's very difficult to physically control them. So when it's about certificates, it's going to be even harder. The last point, you talk about scraps. I mean, it's tough to have a straight idea on it. You know, my personal feeling, we didn't have a study about it. I mean, for the rest of the figures I provided, we have a study that FEC has conducted. But when it comes to scraps, we didn't dig into this type of topic. My feeling is that scraps are not our key priority right now, you know, and because of the competition you'll have to reach this raw material, you know, aluminum recycling will be a key for all of the producers. So you don't need to put any kind of pressure on it. It will happen by the simple logic of the access to the resource.
Thank you, Olivier. There are people in this audience who will have quite deep studies on this, and it's been quite the subject of discussion, and I've heard a lot about it over the last few years. Frauke, Agora has done a lot of work on this and a lot of studies and very good quality studies, and we look at them all the time. Thank you for that. For you, why is a solution to export such an important topic? I think we've heard, actually it's a segue because we heard from Olivier, and we know in our own studies that, you know, it may not be for everybody, but there are industries and there are installations, et cetera, but I won't take your thunder. Go ahead, please.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, why exports? Well, if we look at the value creation from basic CBAM products, it's still some 20 to 30% of value creation is in export, also in manufacturing for export. Of course, that figure varies very much by sector, by country. It's also going more to the lower side of the margin that I just quoted over the last couple of years. But still, it is a very significant portion, really, of the value creation. And of course, exports currently are not covered. We have CBAM as leakage protection for domestic supply, but not for exports. And that basically means if we don't address it for many sectors, and the more basic you go, the more it matters, they will simply shut down if nothing happens. And that is simply because of the facts of the numbers that we see. I mean, if we look at the cost of basic material manufacturing going to near zero emissions, we look on average at some 40 to 75% of cost increase. Different again for some sectors. For cement, for instance, if you really go near zero emissions, it's even higher. That's very clearly, even though the cost share in the final product for consumers only goes up by a very small percentage point. So if you look at the final building, the final car, it's peanuts. But if you look at the basic material, it matters big time. So that export would simply no longer happen if it wasn't addressed. Now, how to address it? We believe that innovation funds are not the way forward, because it's legally, technically very challenging to do, but also because that money will be needed in so many different ways. And we all know what the constraints on the innovation funds and what that money is going to be needed for in terms of transformation, in terms of supporting consumers in Europe. Social costs is going to be needed for. So those, on average, 14 billion a year can't really be spent on the export compensation. Instead, we're proposing an export adjustment mechanism. And, well, in the first place, let's not forget, of course, the best always solution is carbon pricing across. So that is the cooperation that Europe needs to continue pursuing, because that would still be the best. But we all know that that's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen at the same level as ambition as we need. So an export adjustment mechanism is needed. And what we are proposing here is a free allocation adjustment for the exported share of manufacturing to be maintained. So it's really for the exported share. How could that look? We would basically look at the exported volume of a manufacturer and basically multiply that by a product benchmark. So basically a benchmark on the abatement cost in Europe. And then add a certain factor to basically make sure that we avoid overcompensation. So some kind of reduction factor, very important also to basically increase the WTO acceptance. So this kind of mechanism would allow to extend the free allocation just for this export portion. And such mechanism, very importantly, should be integrated into the ETS, so the same reporting compliance mechanisms would apply. And as such, that mechanism would also not be an exception from the ETS. It would not be a benefit to the exporters, to the manufacturers, but it would be an integration into the ETS. And on that ground, we also believe that it would stand very high chances of being acceptable to the WTO. Of course, the case has never been tested for sure. Europe would have to accept that that test would likely be coming, but there are very good arguments why such a case would be accepted on environmental policy grounds and on the basis that this is an integrated into the ETS matter that is not distortionary. So that's
thank you, Michael. Let me turn back to you, because the same question goes to you to some degree, to a large degree, is that, you know, it is not, we don't have exports. You know, I think that's a truism. I think everybody in this room knows that we should be in this room. How do you tackle this risk in a way that's environmentally grounded, economically efficient, and legally justified? And WTO and what have you. And you're totally correct, Frauke. I mean, this whole CBAM has never been tested in the WTO. I mean, who knows what's going to happen if anybody tests it. But as you add elements of it, exports, whatever, you know, you probably the risk, because nothing is black and white, is the degrees of gray. The risk may increase or depending on how you do it. But Mike, how do you see it? I know we've done some stuff together, but how do you see it? I'm just prompting.
Yeah, so let me start. It was a multifaceted question. Let me start maybe with the environmentally grounded and economically efficient. So I think to ensure that, we first need to really understand the extent of export-related leakage risk across sectors and products, and also the environmental dimension of that. What does that mean for overall emissions globally? And there's work underway. Agora has described, ERCST has done analysis, and the Commission itself has been engaged in such an assessment. A preliminary analysis was released last year with the report on the functioning of the European carbon market, which looked at sort of the combined factor of emissions intensities and export intensity of affected products. But of course, this analysis, this review is being expanded as part of the review mandated under Article 30 of the CBAM regulation. And so we'll learn more of how the Commission thinks about this. I think it's worth noting, and Frauke alluded to this, that there have been voices, especially in sort of the environmental advocacy community, that have been critical and have on average sort of suggested not to go down the route of export rebates or other solutions to export related leakage, even though, and I think it's also worth mentioning that they're also very acutely aware that there's a tremendous political pressure on the export issue, and that not addressing it risks destabilizing the political consensus underlying the CBAM, which they very much want to keep, because it is the key to phasing out free allocation. So why have they been somewhat critical? The concerns have been centered around this fear that exempting or providing relief for exported goods, which would effectively reduce the carbon costs facing producers of such exports, could create a perverse incentive, let's say, to produce more carbon-intensive goods for exports, and thus potentially even lead to an emissions increase. But I think Frauke already highlighted that, the design of any sort of solution for export-related leakage can address that and counter the perverse incentive if it builds on the methodology that we have been using and practicing for decades now under the EU ETS, where you provide a dynamic marginal incentive by providing partial free allocation based on the most efficient producers. So in the case of a CBAM, such an export solution, and the government of France a few years ago introduced a proposal to this effect, would again not provide full rebate or exemption, but rather a partial one, reflecting the most efficient producers to give an incentive for continued decarbonization. Let me say a few words about the legal concerns that have been mentioned. As a lawyer, as a trade lawyer, this is of course something that resonates with me, and it's really been hanging over the discussions of export-related leakage. We have heard variously that the legal services of the European Commission have sort of flatly concluded that any relief or compensation for exporters could violate WTO law and is this very risky, potentially constituting a prohibited subsidy under the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures of the WTO. And the importance of that is that the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, unlike the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, does not contain a general exception for environmental protection or conservation of natural resources. So there's a fear that there's no safeguard clause that might nonetheless heal a discriminatory or a prohibited subsidy in some way. I think the risk is there, but it's not like the CBAM, as you just said yourself, Andre, is itself not, is entirely free of risk. It's not been challenged yet. It may be eventually. And I think it's also worth noting that any such decisions here are a matter of political priorities. And against the evolving geopolitical backdrop, there's definitely been a recalibration of the value and importance of the multilateral rules-based trading order vis-a-vis other concerns like competitiveness, etc. Now, at ERCC on the solutions, we've also thought about solutions like Agora and really reviewed the literature, including legal opinions on export solutions. And obviously, I can't go into too much detail, but I think we've also found a solution that's workable. We call it a system of incentive-aligned export adjustment certificates that in many ways resembles what Frauke described in Agora's own proposal. Ours was published in March 2022, and we're revisiting that and going to release an updated one soon.
Thank you, Michael. Adrian, thank you very much. You've been patient, and just wanted to come back to you. That now regard to the extension to indirect emission, how important and how would it be possible?
Yes, thank you, Andre, and thank you for the organizers for having me on the panel. For those who don't know Sandbag, we're a climate think tank that does data analysis and advocacy to improve EU climate policies. So is the extension to indirect emissions important? Yes, and very much so for at least three reasons. One is a climate argument, one is a competitiveness consideration, and one is a budget argument. The climate argument is that grid emission intensity in third countries tend to be higher than in Europe, and that results in imported emissions. And in some sectors like secondary steel, indirect emissions can be up to 15 times direct emissions. So not counting those emissions in the price of imported goods, that creates carbon leakage. And this is the current situation, but it could get much worse. As you know, for example, hydrogen is sometimes branded as the solution to decarbonization. In the case of steel, it's a possible source of decarbonization. But if you look at hydrogen made from grey electricity, so carbonated electricity, not renewables, from renewables, it could emit more, the resulting steel could emit more CO2 than if it were coming out of a blast furnace. So letting such imported hydrogen steel not pay for the CBAM would encourage these kind of practices. Now, the competitiveness reason, so carbon makes electricity more expensive, and some EU producers pay for the carbon through their electricity bills, and many of them don't receive any compensation. So there is a scheme through the ETS, indirect cost compensation, that allows member states to compensate their factories, but not all of them apply it. And so it's only 14 member states who participate in this scheme. For factories located in the remaining 16 countries, so the ETS is 30 countries, right? Not just 27. So the remaining 16 countries, they don't have, so not having a CBAM on indirect emissions creates unfair competition with imports from overseas. And this imbalance is likely to get worse because EU producers face more indirect costs due to electrification, and importers will use more electricity because it's CBAM free. So this is the competitiveness argument. Then the budget argument. For those countries who grant indirect cost compensation to their industries, it costs a lot of money. France just spent in 2023 600 million euros, Germany 1.6 billion, and the bill is going to rise. It's likely to rise with electrification and also with carbon prices, right? Instead, a member state could be receiving money with the CBAM. And for the competitiveness of the industries located in those countries where there is compensation, indirect cost compensation doesn't look that much better than the CBAM, in fact, for them, because their compensation is based on a certain efficiency factor, and it only covers 75% of that factor. So having done a little math, for France, it's 0.33 EUA per megawatt hour, and for Germany, it's 0.54 EUA per megawatt hour. And by comparison, in China, the grid intensity is 0.58. So Chinese CBAM would be higher than current indirect cost compensation to EU producers. Now, how to implement the coverage of indirect emissions, under the CBAM? In the share of indirect cost that is not covered, so the 75% covers indirect cost compensation. Then there's 25% remaining emissions or costs that are not covered by the indirect cost compensation, and also 16 member states don't apply this compensation. So for this share, member states could actually, there could be some coverage of the CBAM just to cover the remaining share. And for the share that is actually covering indirect cost compensation, well, member states should think carefully about the implication for their finances and their competitiveness. And I'm not sure this compensation is the best option for them. Now, there's one thing to look closely in the coverage of indirect cost of indirect emissions, and this is a potential loophole with the possibility to avoid the CBAM if a company is connected to a renewable energy source, for example, through a power purchase agreement. This could allow companies to avoid paying CBAM on their indirect emissions, and it should be instead based on default values rather than actual emission intensity values. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. And you also have to realize that you are now getting into yet to be defined, a number of yet to be defined things, and you're also getting into a increasingly politicized conversation, increasingly, whether you like it or not, because you know, I'm not sure if everybody has a different model for electricity market and how the grid is defined, and probably the Brazilians or the Chinese won't be very happy if we go and define their grid intensity. But nevertheless, it is an issue that needs to be highlighted. But now I'm coming back to Frauke, because this is my favorite topic, and my favorite question: what is resource shuffling? It's like, you know, it's like my mother used to say, it's bon goût. You know when you know when you see it, because I don't know what it is, and everybody has a different definition of resource shuffling. Michael, who is in the States and looked at California, which is the closest that will be kind of a border adjustment, and they haven't done it yet. They're still struggling with the topic. So this is not an easy topic, and as we have learned repeatedly, usually the offense is better than the defense. And as such, people would invent something new all the time. So, Frauke, what is your view on resource shuffling? How do you define it? You'll know it when you see it.
No wonder it's your favorite topic. I guess we are discussing lots of complex ones here, but this is probably one of the most difficult to address. Now, when it comes to the definition, what do we understand as resource shuffling? It's really when exporters basically choose the cleanest industrial plants for exports and then use the more polluting ones for domestic consumption or export to other countries. But basically use the cleanest unit for export into the European market. So it's not basically what we understand or call transshipment, so going through other countries to import to the European market to circumvent certain mechanisms. It's not other ways of circumvention, but it's really this accounting the cleanest units for import or for export to the European Union. Now we looked into some elements when it comes to resource shuffling. And if we first look at the primary emissions for primary materials, really from an emissions perspective, in the first place today the market looks relatively homogeneous, and to a large extent Europe's position doesn't look too bad. So what we've done was basically to look at the from an emissions perspective, CO2 performance perspective, at the 10% best in Europe, how they did for product categories, cement, steel, aluminium, and compared that with the best in class globally. And when we look, for example, at cement, if we take the 10% best in Europe, they already outperform basically what we see in the rest of the market. If we now assume that over the course of the next years, basically the cement sector follows those 10% better performers, then in principle, when it comes to CO2 emissions, Europe is in a quite good place in the international comparison. For steel, the situation is a bit more complex. For steel, we basically have some 50 to 60% of steel plants that need to undergo reinvestment in Europe until 2030. A lot of those investments at the moment are planned to go into directly reduced iron, so moving from blast furnaces to DRI based on gas or hydrogen. If that happens, again, Europe will be comparable with the top of the class globally. So again, purely from an emissions perspective, we might see a certain time lag, but by and large, it's looking quite good. Now, of course, that does not take into consideration the additional manufacturing costs that may go along with the cleanest production options. And there is a question on how are these covered? Are those covered entirely by carbon contracts for difference? Are they covered differently? So that's a big question that comes in. But then I think the real question when it comes to resource shuffling is what Adrian just alluded to, and that is electricity, that is secondary emissions. Because here we have a much more heterogeneous context. And I think Adrian said it all. Accounting for electricity emissions is extremely difficult, is extremely complex. If you just go on the basis of very simple PPAs, we will probably see a lot of resource shuffling. So it will have to be more sophisticated. We may be able to learn here from 3 years of negotiations on defining criteria for green hydrogen. And indeed, the alternative is to look at national averages. But I think underlying that is another much more fundamental problem, and that is Europe's challenge, both when it comes to electricity prices in international comparison, but also, as a matter of fact, there are countries globally that also on a national average are a lot more advanced when it comes to the decarbonization of the electricity sector than some of the European member states. So that's one of the big challenges to address, and that's not so much of a leakage problem, but also a question of getting that clean electricity scaled up in Europe further.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, this is Paris, and this is, liberté, égalité, fraternité, this is where it was invented, but also CBAM was invented here because it initially was a Lafarge invention many years ago. I do remember that when you were there in Rue de Bellefeuille. But there's also the place of the Paris Agreement. And if you risk yourself, I think, if you know, because we've been with Michael and with my other colleague that will be later on, Aaron Cosby, we were in South Africa and Brazil, and they made choices. And we asked them, what do you guys want? What would you want to have? And the Brazilians like this stuff because they're their electricity is largely decarbonized. The South African kind of blow a gasket when they heard this. So this is going to be a very politicized and very contested issue. It's, again, if you're talking about exporting about this, you are entering very much in the domain of political debate. But now turning back to Adrian, if you talk about resource shuffling, you talk about circumvention, there you go. I mean, you have one called CBAM scrap loophole. And that, what is called circumvention, or it just happens to be a loophole, or you put it under circumvention, I don't know. But to me, it's a way around this, and this is what circumvention is. So can you tell us a little bit about the work you've done? I've now listened to in some other fora with great interest, but I think our audience would like to hear that.
Yeah, sure. So I think you're referring to a study that we called A Scrap Game, which we did in June 2023. That was looking at the impact of the CBAM on major trade partners, just a selection of big ones. And we created this resource shuffling scenario in which importers boosted the scrap content of their steel and aluminum products without any major change in their production process. And in that scenarios, importers paid little CBAM because of the low carbon scrap content. But they were also able to charge more for their products in Europe because as a result of the phasing out of free allocation, prices of goods in Europe will increase. And these combined effects resulted in, for some countries, in a net profit. And so we didn't use the term loophole in the study, but clearly resource shuffling can lead countries to avoid the CBAM without really improving their emission intensity. So luckily it can be closed, this loophole, and we propose two ways. One is clearly to attribute embedded emissions to scrap. This can be done easily for primary scrap, so the one that is actually produced during the steel making process. Some call it the pre-consumer scrap or process scrap. Now it's more difficult to estimate for the secondary scrap, so the end-of-life objects that are collected, but still it can be estimated on average. So this is one way, but we could go a step further by using default values. So currently importers can sort of opt for default values or actual data. And the fact that it is up to them to decide may create some optimization strategies that are not very desirable. So the Commission is planning to apply a markup to make these default values quite punishing, as I understand. So what we propose is that instead of letting importers decide on a case-by-case basis, having the choice of default values decided at country level And this could be done through bilateral agreements with the EU. The EU could enter into such agreements that would cover all CBAM products or only some of them. But what is important is that they should apply systematically in that category of products. That would totally eliminate the potential gains from resource shuffling and also probably some fraud as well. So you might wonder, why would our trade partners agree to something that prevents them from cheating the system, basically? Well, there could be a number of reasons, actually. Easier reporting, less data disclosure. Some are more sensitive than others. Less need for independent verification, so fewer contractual levels. And also lower default values. Like I said, currently the plan is to apply a markup, so make default values punishing. But if there's a bilateral agreement, the default values could simply be country averages. So for those reasons, third countries could have interest in actually opting for default values. For EU businesses, that would mean simplification, and I think it would also be good for the climate, because default values based on country-wide emission intensity would push our trade partners to reduce their overall emission intensity, rather than just shuffling resources around. Finally, default values would introduce a level of international collaboration if done on a sort of agreement level. So that's something that could be useful for in the context of fighting climate change to at least agree on something.
Adrian, let me ask you a question, because this is going to, the audience area scrap interesting. I mean, scrap, you think how much is this stuff? How material is this stuff? Do you have any sense of, is this a material amount, or this is kind of the margins and okay, a bunch of people are going to be unhappy?
So right now, we've collected data of like scrap usage again in different countries. These data can change totally if suddenly scrap could lead to avoiding the CBAM. So countries that export to Europe products that are 20% scrap, suddenly they could go up to 100% just to benefit the system. Now, it's not always possible to produce high-quality product from like post-consumer, bad quality scrap, but still you can produce decent product through, for example, pre-consumer scrap. This is totally controllable by manufacturers, and even post-consumer scrap. I visited a plant that created secondary aluminium from collected scrap. They had a really good procurement department that sourced the best quality secondary scrap, end-of-life objects that were perfect, just as good as primary scrap. And so these kind of products could meet the high quality standards. And
very well. Look, actually, in this case, I will have probably the luxury of time for questions. But not before coming back to Maria Elena. How will, these are also questions, hypothetical, questions that you may or may not be able to answer right now, but nevertheless, I think they're questions on the mind of a lot of people. And yeah, we've done work on it ourselves, but how will CBAM take into account the carbon price paid abroad? About a year and a half ago, we landed in Delhi, and the India Times or Delhi Times, I can't remember what the exact name is, said the big headline: the Indian government has agreed with the European Commission that they will put a tax at the border and tax exports to the EU, and the EU has agreed to that. Furious rebuttal from Brussels. But what are you going to continue? What are you going to count toward effective price paid? You know, is things like, because there's there's discussions around Brussels. There's people that ask us all the time in the international arena, am I going to be able to use offsets, Article 6 offsets? Can you tell us a little bit about what the thinking is at this point? Because again, this is something yet to come.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure we have a lot of time. This is not a topic that you can exhaust in 1 minute. But what I can say is that the regulation is clear, explicit price on carbon, so carbon taxes, and also on the basis of emission trading like system allowances, they will surely be considered in terms of non-double taxation, non-double burden, if you want. Because the same carbon shouldn't be subject twice to the same level of adjustment. So it is a system that not only ensures that any material is not burdened twice, but also increases what we call the climate diplomacy, because talking to a number of countries, and we have seen many third countries, they understood that in the process of cleaning up the industries, because in the end I never stop reminding that a successful CBAM is a CBAM that does not exist, they can get the sums themselves instead of handing them over to the EU. So that has for them a double benefit. Increases the incentive to green the production, plus the adjustment goes to the treasure of the exporting countries rather than to Europe. We are building on the experience of the transitional period, during which it was requested from importers not only to declare the quantity and the emissions they were aware of in the production, but also those taxes or measures that had burdened their production in the place in which it took place. So we were able to have a first idea of how things are looking around the world. We have at the same time requested an external consultant who is currently performing that to have a study of the different measures that are applied all over the world in this sense. And then we will draw our conclusions. And now an output could be to have easy references values for each country and for each good, so that it would be easy and would ensure legal certainty for those that are importing. They would always have a possibility to declare the actual emissions, but in case this would be, and the actual taxes that or emissions that they have really paid, but also they could refer to pre-filled fields, let's say. And we are working on all this. It's very, very interesting to hear. This comes at a very timely moment, because that's when we are looking at all these issues. For some, we already have some ideas that unfortunately not mature to be disclosed. But I can reassure you, we are working on all of this. Thanks.
No, we look. Speaking for myself now, the places where I've been and listened to what TAXUD has given us, has certainly there's been clarity. It might not always people agree to everything, but there's been clarity and they've been forthcoming with information. So at least from myself as a moderator, I can say that. Olivier, you have been quiet for a while now. I mean, is there any reaction to some of the stuff that you hear? Because again, you're right. It may be the forgotten fork, but it's not. I mean, we all use forks and pots and pans and so on. So, anything that you want to react to what you heard from these nice people?
I fully get the complexity of the topic, and my outcry here is kind of simplistic, but it's a way for us to tell to this community that, I mean, behind this complexity, you've got people, you know, and companies, you know, and putting the pressure on companies through the CBAM is excellent for the planet, but you need also to think about what's going on. So I get all the complexity behind all these topics, and I hope that we'll find a way out of all this complexity, not setting aside any company or European company, because, I mean, when we look at the big figures, I mean, theory is always, I wouldn't say easy, but theory is not even easy when you look at the big figures. So when you look at the small ones, all the loopholes we are trying just to fulfill, I mean, we are in these loopholes, and I hope that we'll be able to find ways to put concrete, you know, study case on each of the mechanism we are going to develop in the coming months, try to adjust this.
So you mean like it could be very well, but if it kills you, it's not going to work very well?
Yeah, sure.
Well, listen, you know what President Reagan used to say? He said the recession is when your neighbor loses a job, and depression is when you lose your job. So it may work for everybody. It doesn't work for you, then you know. I mean, we're not going to have forks made in France. To make a long story short, and we want that. Michael, let me turn to you for a moment, and any of the other people that want to answer this. I mean, there is this discussion about default values that have been mentioned repeatedly, and again, I said that we're stepping into a political, but also WTO type of place. You are a lot better than me at WTO. I'm probably more a UN person, but what would be, would imposing, the question that pops up here also is anonymous, would imposing default value be WTO compliant? Shouldn't foreign producers be allowed to declare actual emission, notably if they invest in decarbonization? Mike, and anybody, I'm addressing this question to you first, because listen, I mean, you haven't spoken to this, and frankly, probably this would pop up in the next panel, but you live in Washington and you have a surprise every morning. We're all very excited to read what's the new headline. But what would be the reaction in DC and the reaction in WTO? What's your sense if we use defaults?
Ooh, so reactions in DC, I think, are highly unpredictable, and anybody who tells you otherwise is flat out lying. But let's look at it sort of really broader from a WTO perspective. I mean, this is the one issue in the context of border carbon adjustments where we have somewhat more relevant case law. There's a case from 1974, by the way, ironically, both against the US, the Superfund case, Superfund Reauthorization Act, and another case from 1996, appellate body in this case, so even more authoritative, called Reformulated Gasoline. And in both of these cases, the panel or appellate body had to examine, you know, the treatment of imported goods where the US was applying sort of a default or blanket treatment, while US producers were given the opportunity to show exactly how they were producing, etc. And in both of these cases, the WTO dispute settlement body was skeptical of the use of defaults. The argument ended up being one under the chapeau of Article 20 of the GATT, to get very technical, where it was then ultimately found to be discriminatory if you didn't allow the foreign producers to exactly prove in the same way that domestic producers can do so how they have produced those exported goods entering the US. Interestingly, though, when you look into that decision, especially the Superfund case of 74, the panel there also acknowledged that there can be situations where the administrative complexities are such, you know, identifying and also trusting the detailed case-by-case, producer-by-producer reporting in a foreign country and sovereign and, you know, extra-jurisdictional, etc., that it could justify using default values. And I think this is particularly important for electricity, where, again, it's extremely difficult, you know, to reach into other countries' sovereign territory and verify whether what's being reported as we have a PPA, we have captive generation on site, etc., is actually being accurately reported, etc. So I could see there being room for some exemptions in the really more complex context that we're talking about here. So long and short answer, you know, it's, as always with WTO law, it's inconclusive until you have a specific decision on the specific case in point. However, I think there is some room to explore for using default values, especially since these default values would also be, going back to the indirect emissions question, potentially very critical to avoid resource shuffling.
Frauke, did you want to react to that? No. There's, Maria Elena, there's a question for you, which I think you have reacted to, and Gerasimos before has reacted to. What is this 2025 review and what's going to be included in it? People are continue to ask the question. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I think I've mentioned it at length. If you want, I can repeat, but that would be
said
boring.
If there was anything else that you wanted to add that to this particular question. Again, another question that comes in. Again, some of them I know that you're not probably in a position to answer. Which are the downstream sector products in the scope of the Commission for the expansion of the mechanism? You can't answer that. Have you considered including pre-consumer scrap as a precursor? That have you considered including pre-consumer scrap as a precursor? Because there was discussion about scrap. I don't know, maybe Adrian, you want to jump into that as well?
So there's two pieces of legislation. There's the Implementing Act under Article 7.7, which just defines the methodologies for calculating embedded emissions. So this is where potentially pre-consumer scrap, but also why not post-consumer scrap, could be the methodology could be defined for these emissions to be counted in the product's emissions. Now there's also the coverage of the CBAM, which currently doesn't include scrap. So it includes the final steel product, but one of the input, scrap, is not there. So whether this is necessary to allow the accounting for embedded emissions from scrap to be there, I think, I mean, yeah, maybe you would be better.
I can only say that among many sectors, we are considering that as well. But considering doesn't mean being able to take a decision yet. And it's not, as I said, we want to be secretive, is that we are analyzing, studying, and when the time of decisions will come, they will be made public and justified. But at the time, they're simply not mature.
Very well. Another issue, I mean, that I raised, and probably not going to be easy for you to answer, but it is repeatedly popping up on the screen, is will the EU Commission consider Article 6 credit as an effective carbon price paid in third country schemes? If, you know, we meaning we, the EU, are not accepting this at this point, others may choose to do so. How would you treat that? Have that been considered, or this is still in
I will only repeat what the regulations say. And I know that there are some schemes that allow for the voluntary purchase to fill in the obligatory quota. But in principle, my opinion, but we will see in the application, they should not be considered.
Very well. I think that the one thing that I also have in here, somebody gives us a number saying that scrap, because this is becoming a hot topic, is 30 to 40% of global volumes. This sounds like an impressive number. I guess not my specialty, but sounds like an impressive number. And again, all these questions are, by definition, things that are pushing the envelope. And, you know, question is, do complex products such as car being considered? I'm launching the question. Maybe you can't answer it. What do you guys think? Frauke, do you think that like complex products like cars, should that be included in the CBAM?
I can't answer on that specific example, but I would like to basically underline, and now I have to say, I think it was Michael who said that, about basically the additional complexity compared with the shares of emissions that are actually embodied in a product. And I think this needs to be the starting point to have a proper cost-benefit weighting there. And how much does the emissions cost really add to the cost of a car? I mean, we know the figure for steel, the primary steel manufacturing cost for clean steel goes up by, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think it's very, very broadly around the 70% or so. I would have to look it up. But for a car, for a final product, it's basically a few percentage points. And this is the order that we need to look at in order to weigh at which level products should or shouldn't be included.
I know there's a bunch of people in the room that'll tell you the exact numbers, but again, we don't have that format, so I can't ask them. I think that we'll have to stop here. I had a bit of flexibility in this panel to go a little bit longer. Thank you very much, Olivier, Marielena, Frauke, Adrienne. Thank you very much for join me in thanking the panelists for this, and let's move to the next panel. We are now entering in panel number 3, and I would like to invite the panelists. The topic of the panel is cooperation with third countries on carbon pricing. And I'd like to invite the panelists Fabrizia La Pecorella, the Deputy Secretary General of OECD, Helen Dickinson, the Director of Business and International Tax at His Majesty's Treasury in the UK, Khan Morali, which I believe is on the telly, the head of Carbon Pricing Department of the Climate Change Directorate at the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change in Turkey, Sebastian Pacot, head of the Task Force on International Carbon Pricing and Market Diplomacy at DG Klima. And last but not least, again, a colleague and a friend, Aaron Cosby, who is a senior associate at IISD and a senior associate and fellow at ERCST. So I welcome them all. Somebody who is missing? Okay. Yeah, I know. Okay, but yes, you're right. Both Aaron and Khan are online. Now, this session, now we are now delving in the area of international cooperation. We have heard about carbon pricing and the CBAM being an incentive in other countries by replicating the carbon price paid by European producers in importing certain emission-intensive goods in the EU. The CBAM indirectly encourages producers in third countries to decarbonize. This session will present initiatives to support third countries in their decarbonization efforts, in particular in the area of carbon pricing. It will also provide an opportunity to discuss work underway in other jurisdictions on the possible implementation of their own carbon border adjustment and carbon market. Now, we are in the in a different universe here, because the topic of climate and trade is becoming an increasingly hot topic, and one of the ways that is being mentioned here clearly is decarbonize. The other one is to have an effective carbon price that is equal or equivalent. We're not quite clear what that means with what the EU is doing. You heard Michael Melling talk a little bit about happening in DC. I can tell you that the topic of international cooperation, multilateralism in trade and climate change is something that is increasingly becoming important. I, for once, for my sins, chair in the UNFCCC response measure, and I can tell you that Article 3.5 of the Framework Convention is now part of the work program, so that implies unilateral trade measures. There are efforts in many other countries, and people will talk about. One of them is obviously the UK is here, and we'll hear about it. But I will start by first turning to Fabrizia La Pecorella. Thank you very much, Fabrizia. And the first question will be, what is the OECD doing to support the adoption of more ambitious climate policies? And among these climate policies, what is the current pricing around the world? We do know, and we all have seen OECD, World Bank, ICAP, you name it, AIDA reports about the state of that. There is a nominal, there is also a real state of the carbon price, of the carbon pricing, because not all carbon pricing mechanisms are the same. So You have the floor, please.
Thank you, André. Good evening to you all, and let me thank the colleagues at the French Ministry of Economy for the invitation. Well, I think I should start, putting into context, the work that we do in this space, and it all starts from a very simple observation, and the observation is that most countries are committed to carbon neutrality, but they pursue this goal by adopting different approaches.
I'm being told just for people to hold it closer to the. I'm sorry.
But they pursue this goal. So most countries are committed to ambitious climate goals, but they pursue these goals by adopting different approaches based on their political, economic, and social national circumstances. And climate policies range from economic instruments like subsidies, taxes, emission trading systems to regulation, government investment, information campaigns, and voluntary initiatives. So at the OECD, we recognize that these diverse approaches all entail significant international spillovers, and this is why we believe that effective global action to achieve net zero requires integrating these approaches. And to support the effort towards integrating the different approaches, we provide access to the best available data, and we provide insights on what works, what policies work better, what policies do not work so well. And we do that in particular through an initiative, the Inclusive, that has been already mentioned in the first panel, the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, which takes stock of existing policy instruments across countries and assesses their effectiveness in reducing emissions. Now, coming to what we do to support carbon pricing worldwide, we observe that there has been significant progress globally in carbon pricing, and this, is perhaps not a surprising observation if we take into account that carbon pricing as a market-driven mechanism is the most cost-effective tool for achieving greenhouse gas emissions. So we know that by putting a price on carbon, we create incentives for businesses and households to lower the emissions and invest in clean technologies that can support long-term decarbonization. And the key strength of these instruments is that carbon pricing leverages the private knowledge of households and business on their abatement costs, overcoming the asymmetry of information between regulators and polluters. So polluters, that have to pay a price for carbon will reduce emission up to the point where the marginal abatement cost equal the carbon price, and this will ensure cost-effective reduction across the economy. Now, obviously, carbon pricing is a cost-increasing measure, so it increases the costs for firms and households, but it generates revenue. It generates significant revenue, and these funds can be used in many ways to mitigate negative impact on vulnerable parties, vulnerable business, most vulnerable businesses, most vulnerable households. It can be used to actually safeguard the competitiveness of domestic industry or to fund, climate action and to fund innovation. Now, and this is what is happening in practice. You know, under the EU ETS, you know, revenues are used to support energy intensity industries and efforts for industrial decarbonization. So this is, you know, what explains what we observed. Looking at the numbers. According to the latest OECD carbon pricing and energy taxation database and our publication pricing greenhouse gas emissions, the 2024 edition of this, which looks at carbon pricing efforts in 79 countries, and this year covers all the EU member states. Our sample, our countries represent approximately 82% of the global greenhouse gas. And what we observe is that 42% of emissions worldwide are subject to a positive net effective carbon rate, which is a significant result. So what it is, a net effective carbon rate is a carbon price that takes into account all explicit and implicit carbon pricing. That is, by explicit carbon pricing, we consider carbon taxes and ETS. Implicit carbon pricing refers to fuel excises, and the net carbon rate is calculated taking into account fossil fuel subsidies. So the outcome is that a 42% net carbon rate is a remarkable result. Obviously, you know, over time, we have observed also challenges in the, you know, looking back at the biennium between 2021 and 2023 as a result of the global energy crisis. Of course, we have observed the impact of the government's responses to the energy crisis, through which fossil fuel subsidies have been increased in many countries and fuel excises taxes have been decreased. And this, you know, has caused the effective carbon rates to drop from 17 euro to 14 euro per ton of carbon, of CO2 equivalent. But despite this thing, now we observe that a renewed commitment for climate action. So the EU, I mean, is set to introduce is ETS2 to cover, you know, more sectors, transports and buildings, starting in 2027. China is broadening its ETS to include industrial sectors. India and Turkey, we will listen, you know, later, are developing their own carbon pricing instruments. Let me just finish on what we do for monitoring progress, because monitoring progress in this space requires, obviously, comparable and transparent carbon pricing metrics. And we, you know, what we do at the OECD is to provide best practices and technical expertise and analytical tools to help countries integrate carbon pricing into their broader climate policy. The methodology, the common methodology that we use to measure our our effective carbon rates actually allows policymakers to compare progress across country and over time. And I think this is an important and essential support for carbon price across the world.
Thank you, Fabrizia. I'd like now to move to Aaron. Aaron, are you online?
I am.
And you're awake? Because Aaron, for those of you that don't know, Aaron is 9 hours behind us somewhere. He lives somewhere at the bottom of the ski slope in British Columbia, so we're very envious of him. Question to you is very much about international cooperation, Aaron. Is how to foster international cooperation on border carbon adjustment, taking into account actual development levels and trade outcomes, as well as, if you want, picking up on some of the work we've done together on the the very diverse approach to climate change policies in different countries?
An excellent question. Let me first thank the Ministère for inviting me to be part of this panel and express my apologies for being unable to be with you in person. Ski slope notwithstanding, I do wish I was there. I can see three types of problems for which international cooperation is needed, and that then tells us something about how to foster that international cooperation. The first, and we've dealt with some of this in the previous panel, is what I call a spaghetti bowl. That is, the EU CBAM is not going to be the last instrument of its kind. We already know that the United Kingdom will have a similar instrument as of 2027. Other countries considering similar regimes include Canada, Australia, the United States. Basically, any country which is embarking on climate ambition will have to think about instruments like border carbon adjustment, like the CBAM, in order to prevent against leakage in its industrial sectors. Now, that means we will probably have several of these things, many, perhaps many. Absent intentional coordination at the international level, that is going to lead to a proliferation of different requirements for the measurement, the reporting, the verification of embodied carbon in the goods that are covered. And the final result will be that an exporter will have to comply with different standards for these things across all of its export countries. And that's a terrible spaghetti bowl of trade restrictive regulations, absolutely not what we want. So there is an urgent need then for international cooperation to find agreement on, if not harmonization, then at least interoperability of carbon accounting, reporting, and verification protocols. So that's the first area. The second area, I guess you could call minimizing costs. I mean, even the best designed border carbon adjustment regime is going to increase the costs, the burdens for foreign exporters who will now have to calculate their GHG emissions, report on them, and have those reports verified. Those costs will be disproportionate for developing country exporters who tend to have fewer existing GHG accounting requirements and therefore have to set up these systems from scratch, who tend to have higher GHG intensity of production, who tend to have limited means of state support for decarbonization, and certainly these kinds of costs will have disproportionate impacts on any small or medium-sized exporter from no matter what country. So the need for cooperation here is that any country adopting a border carbon adjustment should ideally be assisting in defraying those costs, and you know, even in a more ideal world, should be helping in the process of decarbonization of industry in developing countries. Ideally, if we have more than one country with a border carbon adjustment, this would be done in an internationally coordinated manner to make that kind of assistance more efficient. The third area, and maybe more controversial, I sometimes call taming the beast. And it starts from the understanding that border carbon adjustment is not a single instrument. It's more like a decision tree. At any point during the elaboration of a border carbon adjustment regime or a CBAM regime, you come to design choices which will take you in one direction or another. And the sum of those design choices can result in a very different regime at the final outcome. And that regime can land on a spectrum anywhere from pure environmental protection all the way to pure protectionism of an unfair kind. The challenge then is to help domestic policymakers build regimes that end up further on the spectrum toward environmental protection. Because to be clear, during the elaboration of these schemes and at every one of those decision points, there will be domestic interests which lobby for an instrument that lands toward the other end of the spectrum. One of the ways to help us get there is international agreement, international guidance on what constitutes best practice in the design and the implementation of border carbon adjustment. And having that in hand will help those domestic regime builders defend themselves against the lobbying efforts of domestic interests, and will also provide the rest of us with a measuring stick to judge the outcomes that they achieve. I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the International Institute for Sustainable Development, of which I'm part, has been working on that kind of guidance over the last couple of years with the help of an international group of stakeholders.
Yeah, Aaron, and one of the things that you mentioned is the middle one, whereby the cost, which could be considerable for those that have to actually put in application and report may not be marginal. I think we've made some case that maybe part of the CBAM money could be used in a useful way that way, considering there's not huge amount of money anyway. Let me turn this, since we're talking about the people making the rules, turning to Sébastien Pacaud, who's the head of International Carbon Pricing Task Force at DG Klima. It's not a new initiative anymore. I mean, we could say it was new for a while. Now it's not that new anymore. So what we're very keen to hear from you is what the Commission is doing in supporting certain countries in designing and implementing their own carbon pricing mechanism. I know, one of them will come after this in the speaking order, but I'm sure there are many others. Sébastien?
Thanks, André. Thanks for the smooth moderation. Thanks to the organizer for this very well-organized event. So you asked me, what is the European Commission doing? If you don't mind, I will start with the why. So why do we try to support developing countries and others in developing carbon pricing schemes? I don't want to move that into a sales pitch for carbon pricing, but we have at least 3 good reasons. And the first one is because it works. And we know that it works because within the scope of the ETS in the EU, since it has been set up, we have decreased the emission by almost 50%. So it do work in cutting the emissions. And it works in a cost-effective manner because the operators can choose to cut the emissions where it's the most cost-effective. They can start with the marginal abatement, which is the cheapest, and then move towards innovation. And if they innovate, they can decrease the emission instead of paying for those allowances. So good, cost-effective, innovative. Then, as said by Fabrizia, it generates revenues that can be reinvested into the transition, including into supporting the industrial decarbonization. And finally, it's a system that allows for predictability. You have a cap, you see where the emission should be in the next 10 years, and also with flexibility when the right mechanisms are embedded. So we believe it delivers, and in the EU we can prove it. But we don't want to be the only one to use that. For one good reason is that you all know, I think you will all agree, that if the EU is the only one to cut this emission, it will not be good, neither for us, neither for the planet. So we want others to move, and you know that this year is the year where every country should update its NDC and come with new commitment to demonstrate what they intend to do. We believe that carbon pricing should also be for them one of the most effective ways to cut their emission, and that's why I want to support and encourage the implementation so that they can translate it also into their upcoming targets. And finally, I don't forget that we are in a conference about CBAM. The third reason is obviously that if there is a carbon price from one side and from the other, considering that CBAM allowed to consider the price paid in third country, provided that it's an effective price and that it takes place as part of a carbon reduction scheme, then of course, having a price paid on the other side will smoothen the transactions, smoothen the trade relationship, and will make compliance with CBAM easier. So those are the 3 main reasons why we support. Now, what are we doing? In fact, we had engagement with countries interested by carbon pricing before CBAM. We have a team in charge of the international aspect of ETS, and they've mostly interacted with a range of countries, most being countries which were mentioned by Fabrizia and others, those which already have something in place, starting from Canada, UK, Norway, Switzerland, Australia to some extent, and so on. What we're trying to do now is to go beyond that and engage with all countries which have demonstrated an interest for carbon pricing at different levels. And in fact, it covers almost the entirety of the G20 with 1, 2 or 3 exceptions, and letting you guess who are the 2 or 3 exceptions. No need to name them. But there is a huge interest. I don't want to point countries in particular, but if I try to put them in categories, I also already mentioned those which are an ETS that works. We also have those which have an ETS which functions, but do not really generate emission cut. So they have a price, and either this price is relatively low, or the ETS is focusing only on few sectors, or the ETS doesn't work because the energy sector is too integrated. So they face technical issues, or sometimes political issues, that they need to overcome to have an ETS that really works. And that's exactly where we want to interact with them, exchanging based on our experience, but also the experience that we can spot around in the world, and trying to address those political and technical issues. Then you have a third category, and that's the category of countries which are simply starting to explore, first, a category which is countries which are very advanced in their knowledge, they have a law, a draft law, which is almost there. They have been piloting for some years. I'm thinking about 3-4 countries where it's really close to cross the line, and there they only need either some additional political will or to, again, solve some technical problems, and we want to help them with that. We were very happy to see Brazil crossing that line in December. That's very good news for everyone that a large economy like Brazil has decided to come with an ETS law, and we will try to work at good speed with them to ensure that the implementation works. And then you have countries which are less advanced, but we are exploring the different possibilities, and with them we're also supporting and providing technical assistance, capacity building. What is very important to say is that we're not doing that alone. The World Bank PMI, for example, has done a huge work. Member states are doing a lot, or UK colleagues are doing a lot, and we try to synergize with them. And as I see that we have lots of companies in the room, I would like to say, I hope that when you have operation in another country, you are strongly pushing for carbon pricing in that country too, because that's what you want, to have a level playing field in all countries of the world. So I count on you also to encourage this movement toward carbon pricing, and we'll continue from our side.
Indeed, I'm not going to know names here because I'm not sure who's going to get in trouble, but I know that some of the companies that have been quite active in the ETS have operations in many countries, will act as ambassadors and advocates for this. Let me turn to Khan Morali. Khan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Andre.
Okay, good. Listen, Khan, it's a lot of questions in here, but I'm going to try and make it simple because we have a time problem here. The question really is the fact that you are developing an ETS and you are in the process of working on that. You know, it's a big trading partner for the EU, a big economy, an economy that's expanding and increased quite rapidly. What is behind this decision? What make you guys do this? And what are the challenges that you encounter? How much is the EU experience helping you in doing this? So it's a long question here, but I'm trying to simplify it and give you the opportunity to answer. Go ahead, Khan, please.
Yeah, thank you, Andre. Yes, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the French Ministry of Economy for their kind invitation to this CBAM conference. Also, I would like to welcome all participants in person and online. And really, it is my pleasure to make contribution for this important panel. And I am really sorry I couldn't be there with you. Yes, Turkey is on a way to develop and to prepare their climate law, and our decision to develop our own emission trading system is driven by some multiple factors. First of all, as you know, Turkey ratified the Paris Agreement in 2021 and has committed to achieving a net zero emission target in 2053. This is one of the factors because we have a net zero target, and we consider that carbon pricing and carbon market is a really good to really make good contribution for our net zero target. Also, to support this goal, in the first case, we have updated our national determined contribution and setting a more ambitious 41 of reduction target for our greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to this, we have introduced some key policy frameworks, including the climate change mitigation strategy and action plan. And in the last COP in Baku, we have announced our long-term climate strategy, which serve as a crucial roadmap for us in all sectors, in each areas, to reach the net zero target. Apart from these commitments, we have in Turkey, we are preparing the development plans, and development plans is the basis of the Turkish economy. And this, according to development plans, also we are preparing medium-term programs. And in all these medium-term programs, we emphasize the use of carbon pricing instruments, particularly an emission trading system, as a fundamental tool to drive emission reductions. Also, you know, we are in our all policies we give importance to our climate and climate actions, and as a country dedicated to these global climate efforts, Turkey recognized that establishing a domestic carbon market is essential to achieve our climate commitments. Beyond these environmental concerns, of course, there is also an economic dimension to this decision. As you said, the European Union is Turkey's our largest trading partner, and aligning with carbon pricing mechanisms is crucial for maintaining competitiveness in international markets. In this context, the EU CBAM, of course, is a factor in accelerating our decision, the development of Turkey's emission trading system. Also, the CBAM, we know that is a transformative step in global climate policy. And Turkey, as a major exporter to the European Union, is directly affected. In 2024, Turkey exported approximately 11 billion worth of CBAM-covered goods to the EU. And this brings us to about 45% of our total exports in total. Of course, when in the future EU declares that the scope of the CBAM extension and in these cases, the economic impact will increase further. Also, of course, UK, United Kingdom, also announced its own CBAM as of 2027. It may also affect our trade dynamics. Also, in the ETS, we have also a high-level dialogue with the European Union. We have a carbon pricing working group together with the European Union. We are making some technical discussions with them in this regard. Also, with the support of the World Bank's Partnership for Market Implementation, mentioned by also Mr. Packer, the PMI program is an important step for us in this emission trading system development issues. Also, of course, we believe this challenge can be effectively managed by adopting a tailored policies that align with Turkey's economic structure and development priorities. Also, when we consider the EU side as a candidate country for European Union membership, Turkey has an opportunity to learn from these EU ETS practices. We are.
I'm going to ask you, Khan, to start wrapping up because I have 15 minutes. So I'm going to ask you to wrap up.
Okay. I will summarize all the issues. Yes, in the regard. By considering the EU ETS practices, also in the future we are planning a harmonization project, and by leveraging both these international best practices and our own economic and climate priorities, we are working to establish a well-functioning ETS now, and currently we are working a climate law, and hopefully between in February or March, this climate law will be in force, and we will start to implement the emission trading system later. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Khan, apologies for this. I'm just, I got my own constraints here. So turning to Helen Dickinson. So Helen, I'll make it very short. Why did you do it?
So, thank you, André. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you as well to the Ministère des Économies, des Finances et de la Souveraineté industrielle et numérique for bringing us together for this excellent debate today and inviting me to be part of the panel. So, why did we do it? Well, the UK has always been a strong supporter of carbon pricing and sees this, as Fabrizio was setting out, as a really important and also economically efficient way of meeting ambitious emissions reductions target. In the UK, our target is to reach net zero by 2050, and we see our domestic emissions trading scheme, the ETS, originally named, as a key part of that. And our ETS at the moment covers about 25% of UK emissions, the power sector and sort of heavy industry, and as Sebastian was saying, similarly, in the UK. When I first started working on that in sort of 2012, 2013, it was between 40 and 50% of the UK's emissions. So we've seen the success of that mechanism. So in the summer of 2023, the UK government set out the next stages of that domestic emissions trading scheme, including looking at reducing the allowances that would be available in that phase of the scheme to 2030 by 30%, and also beginning from 2026 to phase out the free allowances that are issued at the moment in our ETS. And this clearly raised the potential risk of carbon leakage, of displacement. And when the ultimate purpose of that emissions trading scheme is to help us achieve our net zero goals and hence contribute to global climate goals of keeping global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, if we're simply displacing emissions, we're undermining both the national and global objectives. And that is fundamentally what led to the decision, which was confirmed in the October budget last year, to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism for the UK as well. And the objective of that is very similar to that of our EU colleagues, that we're looking to ensure that where we have trade-exposed and emissions-intensive sectors in the UK emissions trading scheme, that there is an equivalent carbon price on imports into those sectors. And we also hope, and we've heard that today through several of our speakers, that the introduction of the UK carbon border adjustment mechanism, like the EU's, like the others that are being thought of around the world, will in itself act as an incentive to the further development of emissions trading schemes and carbon pricing mechanisms around the world. Am I allowed to say a bit more about what it applies to? I can do that in about 60 seconds.
While we argue, why don't you just say it?
So we looked at three factors in deciding what sectors the UK CBAM should apply to. Firstly, it needed to be a sector within our emissions trading scheme. We looked at trade exposure and carbon emissions using the same methodology that we use for our domestic decisions on things like free allowances. And we also looked at practical feasibility. And that's led us to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will initially apply to aluminium, hydrogen, iron and steel, cement and fertiliser sectors, which will be introduced from January 2027, and we will be exposing, for consultation with international partners and our own industry, the primary legislation which will enable that later this year. Thank you.
And we do hope that by that time you will be linking the ETS to the UK ETS, and this will all be a moot point. Now, coming back again, because I'm rushing here to question, we heard why she did it, and the question is, why are you going to do it? Because Turkey is also maybe thinking about a CBAM, and you are also a country that has a strong industry, a lot of exports. Obviously, you have some concerns about also being outflanked. I mean, the EU may be worried about Turkey, but Turkey may be worried about other people. So, do you plan to do it, and why do you plan to do it? Sounds like Nixon. Go ahead, Khan.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrea. I will try to be short now. Yes, for sure, carbon leakage is a concern for Turkey. And in this regard, in the past, we have made some studies in this field. Also, I personally prepared an article regarding green transition and carbon leakage. But don't worry, I will not give the details of this article now due to time constraints. But of course, the risk of carbon leakage is considered sector-specific rather than a general economy-wide issue. And while some industries are highly vulnerable, others face lower risks. Based on our studies, the cement sector, iron, steel, ceramics, and the fertilizers are at high risk of carbon leakage due to their high emissions and the strong trade exposure. And for high-risk sectors, yes, we should be somehow worried since risk of carbon leakage is a critical issue. Without proper measures, these industries could face competitiveness challenges or may relocate production to countries with weaker climate policies. We are aware of this fact. And for the overall economy, while some industries at risks, Turkey's overall exposure to carbon leakage is not as severe as some highly industrialized economies, because not all sectors are emission intensive or trade exposed. To address this challenge, Turkey needs some measures, of course, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. This three main approach is that the sector-specific policies, especially for the steel and cement sectors, and critical here sector-specific policies. The other issue is the investing in green low-carbon technologies, and the other is the international cooperation on carbon pricing policies. And I will not give so many details, and I will only make my summary regarding this issue. It is, of course, notable that carbon pricing mechanisms supported with carbon border adjustments can be deemed to address the carbon leakage risk, but also in our climate law, also we are trying to study our CBAM option. Therefore, Turkey may consider implementing our own CBAM option in the future. However, finally, these policies also should be designed and considered carefully by taking possible effects of this measure, of course, in the third countries. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you for your understanding, as they say in the UN Conference for this. Let me, Helen, you spoke to some of the features of the UK CBAM. Maybe there's a few things that you'd like to add, but also about cooperation with third countries. Are you guys doing this, and how do you do it?
Yes, thank you. So 2 questions there. Firstly, how does the UK CBAM compare to the EU CBAM? I set out earlier how we arrived at the sectors that we'd included in the UK CBAM, and the different nature of the UK's sectoral mix and partly our geographical position has led to differences. So, for example, electricity is not captured within the UK CBAM, while it is captured within the EU CBAM. We're also taking a slightly different approach, although with fundamentally the same objective of replicating the domestic carbon price paid. We're taking a slightly different approach to how we're actually going to operationalize our carbon border adjustment mechanism. So ours will, rather than having a certificate mechanism, will be applied as a tax. So those who are liable to pay the tax will have a sort of accounting period, 1 year in the first instance, and at the end of that period they will need to report to our revenue, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and pay the duty owed. We also have a different de minimis threshold, although I think we heard earlier that there may be some changes coming on that front in the EU, but our de minimis threshold is set at £50,000 of CBAM eligible goods per year. And in setting that threshold, we were confident that we would retain 99% of the emissions covered by imports in CBAM eligible sectors, but exclude 80% of the businesses that would otherwise have been liable to register for that tax, 70% of those being small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, in terms of supporting international partners to adjust to the UK CBAM, and we've heard about the importance of those countries that are introducing CBAMs, supporting the kind of global efforts on that. So the UK invests £130 million in support for international carbon market mechanisms and integrity of global carbon markets, and is a sort of strong supporter of the work that Fabrizio and colleagues are doing at the OECD in order that we can kind of support countries to introduce their own carbon pricing mechanisms and also the sort of monitoring and verification. And I'm conscious there's quite an international audience here, both in person and online, and we're very grateful to all of the jurisdictions who responded and contributed to the consultation that we ran on our carbon border adjustment mechanism over last year. And in our response to that, we set out that we would be setting up a specific UK CBAM international group to allow us to continue that dialogue. And we actually formally launched that yesterday. If you go and look at the UK government website, you will find details of the UK Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism International Group, and we're inviting jurisdictions who want to continue to be able to input to our further development on the CBAM, but also get updates on our thinking on that, to get in touch with us to let us know that they want to be part of that group.
Thank you, Helen. Sebastian, you're going to help me. I think that the next question would be very much around how does this help developing countries and our partner country in implementing, and who is involved in this, because you are DG Klima. Before we had Maria Elena and Taksud, but they're, you know, if anything else, the Commission is well coordinated, if nothing else.
Thanks, and good news, I will be very short.
Thank you.
So, 3 points. How does carbon pricing help third country to comply with CBAM? First, if you want a carbon price, you first need to be able to measure well the emission at the level of the installation, and that's also what CBAM asks at the level of product. So if the MRV, so the monitoring and reporting and verification, are well designed, there are a lot of synergies between what needs to be measured to implement a carbon price and what needs to be measured to report on the CBAM. Then second point, if the carbon price is effective, the emission will decrease across the economy and the embedded emissions in the product will decrease, which means that the exporters will have to pay less certificate at the border. So that's an additional benefit for the third countries. And finally, as already said by my colleague from Taksud, the price in itself will decrease if there is already a price applied in the third country, because you know that there is this deduction. So 3 benefits, 3 clear synergies, and 3 good reasons to have a carbon price in all partner countries.
And apologies for rushing you a little bit. You know, we do have a minister, and ministers usually don't like to wait. Aaron, one thing to you before I turn back to Fabrizia. Why is the measurement of carbon intensity at the product level the key in this, in your view?
I'll be brief, but Sebastien has set a very high bar for brevity. Just to remind, the status quo here is that while we have internationally agreed metrics for carbon emissions and intensity at the firm level and the installation level, we don't have any international agreement on how to do that with respect to products, how much GHG is embodied in a particular product. And as I noted before, the risk is that then we get a spaghetti bowl of different requirements for monitoring, reporting, and verification of those emissions. And this is not just a problem, to be clear, for border carbon adjustments. It's also a problem in the context of green government procurement, of GHG intensity standards for goods like oil and gas and hydrogen, for private sector claims and private sector demands up the value chain. So why does this particular need have special status among the many needs for international cooperation? I could list 2 reasons. First, because it is the most urgent. The EU CBAM is now in place, and they have had to create sui generis methodologies for product-based carbon accounting because they had to. The UK is coming on board as of 2027 and will also create those methodologies, and they probably won't be the same methodologies. Others perhaps to follow. And all the other use cases are also advancing. So the further advanced is that dissemination of regimes, the harder it is to get any kind of interoperability and harmonization, because they can't be changed retroactively. That's impossible. So there's an urgent need to get ahead of this challenge. The second reason is that this is relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of the needs and challenges for international cooperation. Some of the other forms of international cooperation are more politically challenging and therefore harder to find international agreement on, but this is a technical challenge. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean it's an easy challenge, and the history of mutual recognition in trade regimes and the history of harmonization of standards should give us pause about the difficulty involved. So it's not an easy challenge, but it is the most straightforward of any of the various areas for international cooperation.
Thank you, Aaron, and thanks for the brevity. Fabrizia, I think that you could also pick up on this, but you
Absolutely.
can pick up on...
No, 3 seconds.
Yeah.
Because I think I have 1 minute.
I don't believe in the 3 seconds, but go ahead.
Well, I should say that I will obviously refer to Aaron's intervention and the fact that he has explained very eloquently all the reasons why measuring carbon intensity at the product level is so important, it's so vital in this space, and the reason why, you know, the interoperability of monitoring, reporting, and verification system that was in his first response, it is so important. So, I mean, now, given that we have to finish, I can only say that at the Inclusive Forum for Carbon Mitigation Approaches, we have established an entire dedicated stream of work on carbon intensity that is focusing exactly on these issues that are so important for the reasons that Aaron has explained, and that we believe are vital for securing that all efforts for decarbonization can be taken forward without impacting negatively the competitiveness of industry and without impacting negatively international trade. So we are addressing exactly the need for how we can leverage monitoring, reporting, verification system to have the information, to report more information at the output level that is needed for making these systems interoperable. I want to stop because the minister is arriving. Thank you very much.
Very well. Listen, we do have questions, but I'm not sure that I'm looking with the corner of the eye on this side. The only thing that would kind of make me think a little bit about, and maybe it's more a rhetorical question, is, you know, there are a number of institutions that participate in building capacity, building expertise in related to CBAM emissions trading and so on. There's the World Bank, there's the the European Union, there's the UK does it, and, many people. How do you coordinate well among these things? That is one thing to think about. The other thing is we will undoubtedly see a drop in some of the effort, maybe coming from across the Atlantic and maybe coming from other places as a result of that. And Europe probably will be asked to step up and fill some of the shoes. It's not for me to say that, but it's something that comes to mind. I would like to ask everybody to thank the panelists, including Khan and Aaron. And so please give a warm thank you to our panelists. And we're now ready to welcome the conclusion. Minister Eric Lombard, Minister of Economy, Finance, Industrial and Digital Sovereignty of France. Monsieur le Ministre.
Bon, very happy to see you. I understand you had a very efficient working day. Sorry I could not attend. I was busy with a question to the government, which is, as you know, a French tradition, which is very lively. I understand we have a certain number of attendants online, so good day to you as well. And it is my great pleasure to close this high-level conference on CBAM, which is one of the mechanisms on which a lot of our future relies, as we all know. First, let me thank the speakers, the organizing team, for making of this conference a success, according to what I've been told by my colleagues. International climate action actually is threatened, unfortunately, as we all know, by geopolitical tensions and the various forms of disengagement. Our intention with this conference is to demonstrate that our climate ambition remains loyal to the Paris Agreement toward future generations. Let me state that very firmly as an opening remark to this conclusion. EU member states, as you know, have set ambitious goals to meet the global climate challenge, reducing emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and making the EU climate neutral by 2050. Those commitments have to be met. It is absolutely critical for mankind. Towards this goal, EU choose the most efficient tool to share effort, which is carbon markets. We believe in this House about the effect of economic mechanism. CBAM was necessary to ensure the EU climate ambition not to be undermined by carbon leakage. it makes sure that greenhouse gas emissions are equally priced for everyone. In short, that all the efforts we do are not in vain. We could have developed CBAM without consulting with our trade partners. We have chosen not to do so. It is a fully transparent and cooperative approach that takes on board all countries outside the EU. So we are particularly happy to have seen so many of you today, in person or online, to share our expertise and to enhance climate action. You represent over 50 countries for all continents, as well as international organizations, including the UN, WTO, IMF, the World Bank, and OECD. So many countries were part of the Paris Agreement and share a mutual commitment. And myself personally, I have a vivid memory of the conclusion of the Paris meeting. Because decarbonization is not negotiable. In France, we have been strongly committed to decarbonizing our economy. Over the past years, greenhouse gas emissions have fallen steadily in France by around 2% last year alone. We must speed up this mechanism, this dynamic, while ensuring it does not jeopardize our competitiveness in Europe. And you also know that the European Commission has on the top of its agenda protecting our competitiveness. Lessons learned from this first year of implementation were discussed extensively during today's first panel. And I would like to thank warmly Gerasimos Thomas from DG TaxUD, the European Commission, for very insightful presentation on this year's figures. We heard about several challenges today in terms of implementation, and the main one, the key one for me, is simplification. I spoke about competitiveness, and on the top of the agenda of the Commission, as well is simplification. European companies are really strongly asking for it, I would say demanding it. We cannot and we will not ignore that there is still work ahead of us if we want CBAM to be truly operational and accepted. We need to make sure that emission reporting under CBAM does not become an operational and unreasonable burden for the companies. This is especially the case for smaller businesses, whether importers or exporters. And I have met many of those companies since my arrival in this minister less than 2 months ago, because they fear that this burden would prevent them from continuing their development and their growth. And we have to take that into account. We are currently working on this issue at European level. It was also on the agenda of the last gathering of the ECOFIN meeting 1 month ago, and the next one will be next Monday, and we will discuss that again. And I hope we come up with solutions in the next weeks. We must come swiftly to solutions because 2025 is a landmark year for CBAM with the end of the transitional period and the review of the mechanism. We must make the most of it. Some key but important technical parameters need further clarification, and we must, for instance, take into account the carbon price effectively paid abroad and ensuring also a robust verification of emissions reporting. Moreover, I hope the review can also touch on 3 more structural risks and improvement levels of CBAM. First, the opportunity of an extension of the CBAM scope to additional products at risk of carbon leakage, especially those down the value chain They have been largely discussed today, and we are committed to making sure that the CBAM prevent carbon leakage for downstream products. Which product? Automobile, various household appliances, medical equipment. Downstream carbon leakage can impact strategic industries. And we are willing to cooperate with the European Commission and partners to develop a list of relevant downstream products. Because CBAM is a condition for keeping production and trade under fair competition. And here also, we know how this point, this constraint of fair competition becomes more a constraint than it was in the past. Second, the speakers highlighted the need for a solution to avoid CBAM penalizing exports. Some interesting proposals were formulated today, and I'm counting on the European Commission to tackle this problem head-on. Third, we need to ensure that CBAM is not circumvented. The implementation of the mechanism is closely monitored by the European Commission, and we will make use of the provisions already included in the CBAM regulation whenever necessary and reinforce them if need be. This comprehensive review will be conducted with one objective in mind: ensure that CBAM is truly effective in preventing carbon leakage. In other words, that it fully delivers on its environmental objective and does not lead to relocation of production, which is obviously a risk that we want to avoid. As you can see, we have a great deal of work ahead, and we have to find the synergies to ensure smooth implementation. Let's keep in mind our ultimate aim, which is as early as possible to be in a position where CBAM is no longer needed. The European Commission, with its International Carbon Pricing and Market Diplomacy Task Force, is doing a remarkable job to promote cooperation on these issues and to support third countries. The OECD also plays a role in promoting and disseminating effective decarbonation policies, and the ongoing work on carbon intensity will be instrumental in this regard. I am very grateful that Fabrizia Lapecorella, Deputy Secretary of the OECD, was able to join us today to present the OECD's commitment in this area. Obviously, working with the OECD is absolutely key in the success of what we endeavor. We will always see that all these efforts are paying at global level. Our speakers today highlighted that more and more countries are setting up their own carbon pricing instruments or working on them to deliver significant emission reductions. This is the case of Turkey, for instance, and I greet the representative of Turkey, Eyüp Kan Morali, who is with us today. Is on the screen over there. Some countries, thank you to tell me where to find him. Some countries, such as the United Kingdom, will also implement their own carbon border adjustment mechanism, and others are exploring ways to do so. And I want to greet the representative, Ellen Dickinson from the UK. These developments are a very good signal and a proof that we are collectively going in the right direction, and obviously we will continue. Now let me end with 3 words I want you to take home today. The first one is ambition. The ambition is one of the Paris Agreement. It is also the ambition that one day carbon footprint will be priced everywhere on the planet. ETS and CBAM are just a ladder toward that ambition in cooperation with all the carbon market globally. The second word I used already is simplification. We must ensure that reporting emissions does not create excessive burdens on the businesses, but we will also do so without compromising on our climate ambitions. And third, the final word is cooperation, a word that maybe will be challenged going forward, but we will stick to that ambition. We are more than ever committed to supporting global efforts towards the green transition, and we are doing so cooperating fully with our international partners. We hope this event has showcased the work that has been done to date and still remains to be done on those three pillars. I want to thank you for your presence, and we hope that we can continue those very useful and important conversations. A final word before leaving you to the networking reception that I'm sure you expect. To strengthen our decarbonization efforts, we will soon host a high-level symposium on the steel sector, which is one of the European priorities. I hope to see many of you to shape a shared vision for preserving and decarbonizing the EU steel industry. Thanks a lot for your participation. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Yeah.